Hello and welcome to Six Part. Today I'm gonna continue the story What If Deku Had None for All Part 2. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up, and to watch more videos like this, subscribe to my channel and turn that bell notification on so you never miss an upload. Now wasting no more time, let's begin.
Thanks to her handy pair of binoculars, Kuen was able to watch the explosion happen through the window of her bedroom from the comfort of her own home. As the plan Deku had shown her came to pass, she grinned wickedly. Additionally, the crime lord fulfilled his promise to her by not having to do a single thing. Even though she had a part that wanted to witness their deaths firsthand, her level of satisfaction was still at an all-time high. Deku, that boy, was a unique individual. Who knew his mind was so cunning? He knew in advance that the Naruhata vigilantes would disband once they learned of the bombs she and her associates had planted in the subway, so he recruited Toga's assistance in tricking Makoto into falling into a trap. He even made predictions about which of them would try to stop the bombs and which would arrive at the cafe. Her heart was warmed by the fact that he was a little evil genius. She had to have him for herself. No, she wanted him. The villain factory would greatly benefit from having him. What did All for One really have in store for him? Perhaps. Deku was unaware that Kuin's sole purpose in Tokyo was to help All for One by arranging for Deku to be caught by the police, not to spread trigger throughout the city. Kuen didn't understand why All for One was so enamored of the boy, but after closely observing his work, she now did. Deku had the power to subdue the entire world. He was an unassuming boy with a homely appearance and a slightly awkward charm. And that's what ultimately made him even more dangerous. After giving it some thought, Kuen made the decision to recruit him by any means necessary. Toga dropped Izuku off at Kuen's apartment, and Izuku showed up. While he went inside to finish up his business with Kuen, he told her to wait for him in the parking lot. After a pregnant pause, the door opened when the oddball boy knocked. To his surprise and dismay, Kuen was there, wearing a silky red dress with no straps that fell just above her knees. She had a glass of wine in her hand and her hair down. "Why hello there, Deku," Kuen emitted as she took his hand and ushered him into the room. Izuku was shocked to discover that Kuen had transformed the living room into a dining area and had arranged a table for the two of them to eat at after she shut the door. He was served a bowl of katsudon, which is a deep-fried pork cutlet served over rice with vegetables and eggs. It was his most favored meal. Kuen said to him, "You like this, don't you?" Izuku nodded his head after taking a quick look at the flawlessly prepared plate. "I do," he replied. After giggling, Kuen moved in closer to him, stroking his arm and whispering in a seductive voice, "I wasn't talking about the meal." Izuku looked at her, examining her eyes. He was able to identify the look she gave him because it was the same longing look Toga always gave him. He had previously always been bashful around girls, and occasionally he would feel too ashamed to approach them. However, Toga's excessive familiarity with him healed him of his timidity. He was aware of Kuen's desires, what she truly desired in him. After clasping her hand in his, he bent down to give her a chaste kiss. The wine residue she had consumed was detectable to him. The subtle yet powerful sensation of Kuen's tongue coiling into his mouth made the oddball boy follow her example. His thoughts became increasingly hungry, and his mind became foggy. Using his free hand, he traced Kuen back down to her flexible posterior as soon as he felt her put her arms around his neck. When he did, he heard her gasp, which was a positive sign for a beginner like him. The only reason he did what he did, or rather was doing now, was instinct. Izuku let the dirty ideas that were lying dormant inside of him take control and lead him from time to time. He reached for Kuen's butt and touched her there, causing her to groan once more. In response, she licked his earlobe and buried her face in his neck. He was unaware that he had a weakness in that area. He was momentarily frozen as a chill went up and down his spine. But he persisted, pushing Kuen farther and farther back until they were both in her bedroom. They continued to lick, kiss, and rub each other in a passionate trance while they were in a passionate embrace. Kuen was flat on her back on top of her bed after one more shove, and Izuku started taking off his clothes. Kuen aimed for his belt first and sat up to assist him. Immediately after removing it, she drew down his panties and leaned in to kiss his member. To put it mildly, the pleasure was so overwhelming that Izuku couldn't help but groan. Kuen kept treating him until she finally gave him a full, lip-to-lip embrace. Izuku groaned more loudly, relishing each and every second of the bliss. His excitement grew, and as he was about to climax, Kuen pulled away and spread her legs wide. That was when Izuku realized, for the first time, that she had no underwear on. It was not necessary to exchange words. While Kuen reached her hand down to guide him inside her, Izuku crawled on top of her and started kissing her neck. After their union was solidified, they both groaned in unison with pleasure, and the bedroom was filled with a chorus of seductive groans. Izuku had long since given up on rational thought. He kept working Kuen's body, observing the movements that made her react in a pleasing way. He discovered that her cries became louder whenever he pumped from an angle. He kept doing that until Kuen pressed her fingernails so firmly against his shoulders that his flesh started to rip. "Why, you're going to make me ah." Izuku knew what he was doing, so she didn't need to say it. After all, he was a quick study. Kuen and he were both in ecstasy after a few more pumps. Exhausted, Izuku turned over in bed. Kuen lay beside him, a contented smile glued to her face. She was staring at the ceiling, but her thoughts seemed to be still floating from the experience. She did not finish saying, she was at a loss for words to explain it. Izuku grinned. More to himself than anyone else. This time, he had really surpassed himself. In addition to getting the proverbial monkey off his back, he did it effectively. Kuen rolled over to him and started to move her finger around his chest. "You should join the villain factory." "I didn't ask for that." "Maybe I should," Izuku said, turning to smile at her. It was then that he bent down and kissed her. He said to her, "Want some tea?" "Sure," Kuen said, grinning subtly. Izuku got to his feet and got his bearings. After redressing, he went into the kitchen and made a batch of herbal tea, pouring it into 2 separate coffee mugs. Then he went back into the bedroom and gave one of the mugs to Kuen. Izuku remarked, "A toast to joining the villain factory." After grinning and touching mugs with him, Kuen drank the majority of her tea. Izuku started to say, before setting his coffee mug back on the nightstand. "I remember back when we first met at the parking garage that you told me that it was a shame. You were talking about all for one setting me up, weren't you?" Kuen was unable to contain her smile. He had worked it out, then? That was to be expected, I suppose. It was inevitable that the puzzle pieces would eventually fit together. All for one knew that Detective Tsukawichi was my mentor, and he said that there wasn't anything about me that he didn't know. So if I follow what he said to its logical conclusion then, Izuku's tone faded away. His voice was solemn, almost dejected. That is, until he started laughing really hard. Izuku's question was obviously rhetorical, but Kuen felt compelled to respond. Then the joke has been on me the whole time, hasn't it? But in this case, what could she say? Nevertheless, his expression was unnerving. His eyes were glazed over and sharper than a predator's, but his smile was as cheerful as ever. "But now, the joke will be on you." Kuen felt her body go limp and her heart rate increase as she processed what Izuku had said. She tried to call forth a swarm of bees as soon as she realized what had happened to her. The least she could do was bring Deku down with her if he was going to poison her the way he had Makoto. But before she could call forth her bees through her eye patch, a pillow smothered her face. Izuku said, not so fast," while he kept choking her. Fortunately, Kuen was unable to resist much because of the horse tranquilizer's effects. He had to make sure he didn't give the queen bee that had become embedded in her any chance to get out, even though he had put enough of the drug in her drink to kill her in a matter of minutes. Izuku persisted in smothering Kuen as her body trembled from the effects of the horse tranquilizer. "You underestimated me like everyone else. But I don't need a quirk to see through lies," she said. Her life would soon come to an end. At last, Kuen's body went completely limp. "All for one? One for all? When I'm done there won't be anything for anyone. There will be nothing at all." Izuku got up and took a match and a matchbox out of his pants pocket. After striking a match, he set it on top of Kuen's and watched it burn. Although he wasn't particularly pleased with his choice, he fulfilled his obligation. Like All for One, she wanted to use him for her own purposes, and Izuku was not going to let anyone else rule his life any longer. He was his own man from this point on. Izuku calmly walked to the kitchen and picked up the bowl of pork cutlets Kuen had made for him as he left the front door of her apartment, which was still burning. There was no point in throwing away a delicious meal, was there? Izuku got into the passenger seat of the car while Toga was still waiting for him in the parking lot. As Toga left the parking lot and rode in the direction of Tokyo, no one spoke. She was aware of Deku's next strategy, which was to defeat All for One. When Izuku was last in a hospital, it was following a gunshot wound. And yet here he was, inside the same hospital's walls once more. He was there as a visitor, though, this time, an unapproved guest. Izuku Midoriya was officially dead, as in, on file. He was killed in a Tokyo police station fire that also killed renowned and well-known police detective Tsukachi Naomasa and several other police officers. Though unverified, there had been reports of his person being sighted in the Naruhata district. Izuku wants them to remain that way, for the time being. Izuku was able to visit a person close to his heart in her own room without being noticed thanks to Kurogiri's warp gate quirk. She slept soundly, and although her breathing was shallow and weak, the oddball boy could infer that she appeared to be in good enough health. Her hair was disheveled and matted, but her color had not faded. She looked almost ill, as if she had lost a significant amount of weight. Izuku walked up to her and took her hand in his, scowling. His heart ached because she felt cold to the touch. Mother. Izuku had learned that his mother had a mental breakdown because she thought he had perished in the fire at the police station. He was unaware, however, that she had been transferred from the mental health unit to the hospital following a stroke. She would never be the same, as far as he knew. And he was solely to blame. He gave her hand a light squeeze as his determination to realize his dream grew inside of him like a fire in a furnace. To ensure that her sacrifice would not go unappreciated, Izuku would establish a world devoid of quirks in her honor. Additionally, he would begin by eliminating All for One, the man who initiated all of the events. But it wouldn't be simple. All for One possessed great strength, intelligence, cunning, and charisma. In addition to leading an endless supply of nomus, he also led a criminal empire. For some reason, however, he consistently favored Tamura. Tamura lacked the characteristics of a leader. He was also short-sighted, hot-headed, and reckless. Despite having every resource at his disposal, he kept failing repeatedly. Izuku learned of Tamura's plan to attack the UA was a complete failure. Kurogiri told him that the plan was just a full-on frontal assault when he asked about the strategy that was implemented. A juiced-up Nomu had absolutely no chance in hell of competing with the one and only All Might. Then, instead of recruiting Stain, he tried to outdo the notorious hero killer Stain by using Nomus to cause chaos and devastation. Unfortunately, because of his own stupid pride, he didn't want Stain to join the League of Villains. Tamura was a loose cannon who could potentially jeopardize all of the villains, and Izuku could not let that happen. Fractures were already present in the group. Once Kurogiri usurped All for One, Izuku was able to persuade him to support his cause because he was a sensible man. Toga would follow him to hell and back because he was so enamored with him, and Dabi didn't seem to care. Izuku deduced that although Dabi had a tendency toward independence, he would be obedient to the person in charge. It would be safe to assume the same thing about Twice. The eccentric boy, however, was unable to get ahead of himself. It was only a pipe dream at the time because he had no real plan to exact revenge on All for One. Deku, Kurogiri said quietly, interrupting Izuku's thought process. It's almost time for the meeting. As he returned his focus to his mother, Izuku nodded to him and put another hand on top of hers in a loving gesture. But as he withdrew, he was able to glimpse a get-well card that was resting on her nightstand. Izuku read it out of curiosity, half thinking it was from his father. The card was from Bakugo, much to his surprise and dismay. Although I'm not very good at this kind of thing, I understand that you must be going through a difficult time right now. I hope you recover quickly. Kindly, Bakugo Katsuki. Izuku was incredulous. A get-well card would never be written by the Bakugo he knew. He must have been put up to it by his mother. Nevertheless, Izuku noticed that there were no more cards in the room. He felt nauseous because he knew that one person should have cared more than anyone else, and that person had yet to reveal his identity. Father, are you now allowing Kacchan to surpass you? Kurogiri yelled at him again, Deku. But this time his voice was ominous. Fortunately, Izuku and Kurogiri were able to get through the warp gate before the nurse who was supposed to enter the room knew that the doorknob had turned. Since Tamura was the one who originally called the meeting, everyone gathered back at the League of Villains hideout and waited for him to arrive. He must have had a big plan in mind because a number of other villains that Izuku had never seen before also appeared. Given that he was able to enlist 6 more villains, it appeared that Tamura was a formidable recruiter. Kurogiri updated Izuku on the latest developments. Mr. Compress, one of the new recruits, was able to literally compress his targets into tiny spheres that resembled marbles, as his name implied. Spinner, a creature that resembled a gecko and had a sword strapped to his back, was another new recruit. According to his costume, he appeared to have been most impacted by Stain's philosophy. A transgender woman with a quirk that could create a magnetized polarity around her was Big Sis Magna. Even Kurogiri didn't know the precise nature of her quirk, but because it was so helpful, Izuku was excited to see it in action. Mustard was another recruit who seemed to have a very practical quirk. The villain boasted that his gas could knock anyone out because, after all, heroes were only human. Kurogiri told Izuku that Izuku could agree with that sentiment. But the other two new hires weren't very good. One had his mouth uncovered and was shackled in a black straitjacket. In particular, he had a fetish for biting off flesh. He was essentially a psychotic psychopath with little use for anything other than wreaking havoc and destruction. Muscular, the last new recruit, could also be considered in this regard. He possessed an amazing quirk that enabled him to enhance his physical prowess to superhuman proportions. Nevertheless, Izuku was informed that he was merely a mindless brute with very little intelligence. He was simply Tamura's type, to put it another way. Izuku had to give him credit, though, because their numbers increased. The League of Villains could organize an attack that would destroy the professional heroes and knock them to their knees because of how versatile each person's quirks are. Tamura started to say, "Good, everyone has arrived," as he walked into the room. "Let's cut to the chase. I have another new recruit in mind and we are going to get him." Izuku gave Tamura a puzzled look as a result. Which new hire would be significant enough to warrant a full meeting to acquire? On TV, Toga rolled. Switched on the monitor to display the UA Athletic Festival. Izuku was forced to frown. His dream was to participate in the festival in addition to attending UA. However, the fact that Bakugo won the festival's top prize even more surprised him. Even so, he had been made to accept his gold medal while being literally gagged and chained. Izuku nearly grinned at his antics. They were, to put it mildly, nostalgic. Maybe he still had pieces of himself that missed the good old days. When Bakugo's erratic behavior was visible to all of the villains, Toga paused the video. "That is Katsuki Bakugo, our new recruit," Tamura said. Everyone supported Tamura's choice and appeared eager to recruit him. Bakugo was irascible, erratic, and angry. Even when compared to professional heroes, his fighting prowess was virtually unmatched, and he possessed a very potent and destructive quirk. Izuku, however, had had enough. He needed to say something. Due to Bakugo's refusal to join the League of Villains. "Gotcha." Izuku put it right. "Bakugo would only join us over his dead body. He is obsessed with All Might because All Might always win, and Bakugo wants to win." At Izuku's interruption, the room fell silent and Tamura squinted. If that was the case, then why was he so angry after he won? Izuku's response to that was inadequate. He had no answer, at least, that was grounded in anything tangible. However, he may have known Bakugo better than anyone else, so he was also aware of his fears. "Someone probably wounded his pride," shrugged Izuku. The word, probably, Tamura stressed. "That means that you don't know for sure, right?" Izuku remained silent. Tamura spat out Izuku's name as though it repulsed him. "So shut your trap. You don't even play a part in this plan. The only reason you're here is because All for One wanted me to include you in the meeting. Know your place, Deku," he said. The air between them was heavy with tension that could be sliced with a knife. But Izuku knew when to give up. He wasn't going to stop Tamura if he was set on carrying out his stupid scheme. Actually, a sly grin appeared on his face, but no one could see it. "Why am I a fool? This is ideal." Izuku's mind was piecing together what was going to happen as if he had been given clairvoyant sight, and it was all he could do not to laugh uncontrollably. Indeed, he would permit Tamura to execute his rash scheme. In addition to some of the most successful professional heroes in history, kidnapping Bakugo would also bring All Might, the ultimate pro-hero, to the world. All for One would have to come out of hiding to face him as a result. Izuku would undoubtedly hope for All Might's victory whenever he faced All for One, as much as he hated to admit it. Because All Might would then be responsible for his own demise. Since it was still thought that he had been killed in the police department fire a few weeks prior, it was difficult to move around the city. Unverified reports of sightings of a person who fit his description had surfaced in the Naruhata ward, but the rumors were just that, unverified. Izuku Midoriya now hopes that it won't remain that way. His ultimate objective was straightforward: to destroy the League of Villains and All for One. The heroes, on the other hand, would fall for his bait and become his helpful pawns in his chess game, but he wasn't going to get his hands dirty. Izuku did, however, have a sort of fanbase within the League. He was aware that Kurogiri regarded him as clever and capable, traits he valued in a person, and that Toga would follow him to the end of the world. Dabi and Twice were the other two League members with whom Izuku had a close relationship. It was unclear where they stood in relation to him. Therefore, the quirkless boy made the decision to pull Kurogiri aside and talk to him before Tamura sent them on a mission that Izuku considered to be at best a stupid undertaking. Additionally, they met in a run-down and deserted warehouse a few blocks away from the League headquarters. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me," Izuku said sincerely to him. I figured that it was important since you insisted that we should speak in private, said Kurogiri. Izuku's favorite thing about Kurogiri was that, when it came to his allies, he was very sane and even giving. His intense devotion was a quality Izuku needed for himself because Tamura's temperament would waste his skills. It is important, and I ask you to keep what I say between us and the parties involved, Izuku stated. You have my word, Kurogiri convinced him. I do not think that Bakugo would join the league in a million years. He was obsessed with becoming the #1 hero, and it is safe to say that he still is, Izuku said. Correct me if I am wrong, but was it not too long ago that you wanted to be a hero? Who is to say that Bakugo would not join our cause like you did? Asked Kurogiri. Izuku's face grew serious. That's what I wanted to talk to you about as well, Izuku said. You know what All for One did to me, don't you? Kurogiri slightly stiffened his stance. I do, was his response. So you and Toga knew this whole time. Does anyone else in the league know? Izuku responded. A rare display of disbelief widened Kurogiri's golden glowing eyes. I was not aware that Toga had any knowledge of All for One's project. Izuku smiled mischievously at Kurogiri. She didn't. She thought that he simply wanted to go out of his way to recruit me. But you just told me that he had a project in place, Izuku replied. Kurogiri took some time to comprehend what Izuku had done, but once he did, the villain was deeply impressed by the cunning of the quirkless boy. It was impressive enough that he discovered that All for One had been responsible for his recent misfortunes, but his intelligence was further demonstrated when he used the information at his disposal to not only conclude that Kurogiri was aware of the situation, but also to take into account the possibility that All for One's scheme involved more than just his recruitment. Kurogiri was so impressed by Izuku's genius that he could only give him a round of applause by clapping his hands together. Bravo, Izuku, bravo. You are every bit the man that All for One said that you would be, started Kurogiri. However, now I must make a request to you, and ask that what I tell you is to stay between us, and us alone, said Kurogiri. Izuku nodded to Kurogiri. I was originally tasked by All for One to oversee Tamura's development so that he could one day replace All for One and take over the league. However, once you were recruited, All for One approached me and gave me a new set of orders. I was instructed to treat you with the same amount of reverence as I treat Tamura. He thinks very highly of you, and I believe that he knew that the day would come when you would approach me. So you're saying that All for One wanted me to discover the truth? Izuku responded. No, Kurogiri put him right. All for One expected you to discover the truth. Izuku couldn't contain his laughter. As he struggled to control himself, his laughter reverberated throughout the deserted warehouse. He found it difficult to do so because everything was simply too ideal. Izuku wiped his eyes and said, Oh, that's a good one. That's rich, I'm almost in tears. And here I thought that All for One favored Tamura over me. I'm glad to know how highly he thinks of me. I am, in fact, truly honored. Izuku's thoughts were not answered by Kurogiri. Anyways, I have a plan in place that I need your help with, Izuku replied. The answer was, I am listening, Kurogiri. Like I said before, Tamura's mission is bound to fail. The difference between Bakugo and I is that Bakugo wasn't pushed into a corner with no way out like I was. He's too prideful to take the route that I did to begin with because he has a very powerful quirk to fall back on. But even if we assume that Bakugo might join us, Tamura's plan could still result in the destruction of the entire league, Izuku said. He was questioned by Kurogiri. How do you figure that? It would be different if Tamura wanted to capture an actual hero, but to go out of his way to capture a UA student, a well-known UA student at that, in the middle of his training course would only succeed in turning our hideout into a war zone. Dozens of heroes would be at our doorstep, including All Might, Izuku told him. Kurogiri started to say, All for One will defeat him once and for all if All Might shows up. With All Might's defeat and death at the hands of All for One, it would only serve to severely weaken the morale of all of the pro-heroes and citizens and in turn galvanize villains everywhere. Really, do you think that? Is what Izuku intended to inquire, but he chose to remain silent. All might be defeated and killed by All for One, but Izuku doubted that he could pull it off. All for One would have done so during their battle all those years ago if he truly had the strength to pull off such a feat. Although he was able to mortally wound All Might, All for One ultimately suffered enough injuries from fighting him to be practically crippled. All Might had Izuku's money. Maybe he was being realistic, or maybe it was the fanboy in him talking. In any case, he was unable to publicly express to Kurogiri his doubts about All for One's capacity to defeat All Might, and consequently his desire for All Might to triumph in order to usurp the league and take its place as its new leader. Although he would have preferred to, if Kurogiri's statement was accurate, he would only follow Izuku once he had established his position. With a menacing grin, Izuku started to say, "Well, let me set the table for All Might's demise. I need you to warp me to the front entrance of the Kyoto police headquarters." Kenji Suragame had had yet another exhausting day at work. As the chief of police, he was born with a quirk that made him look like a dog. He worked hard and advanced in the ranks despite his rather special feature, to put it mildly. Getting to where he is now required a great deal of time, commitment, and self-control, but it was ultimately worthwhile. Kenji was a man who valued justice above all else and thought that the law ought to be construed to support this ideal. For example, when a team of UA he decided to ignore the fact that students had used their quirks without permission to help capture the hero killer Stain. Why? Because it was the proper course of action. However, he was now under tremendous pressure to identify the villain or villains who killed a cherished detective named Naomasa Tsukachi and the courageous men and women who perished in a rather peculiar fire at a Tokyo police station a few weeks prior. The public knew that something wasn't right, even though the incident was officially declared to be a freak accident. Kenji was supposed to work a miracle even though he had no leads, no witnesses, and nothing else. The man who stood for justice was placed in an unjust circumstance. However, that was a fact of life. As the investigations went on, his office was inundated with rather odd details. To begin with, there had been rumors of a drug problem among Tokyo's citizens known as trigger. This drug could increase a person's quirks at the expense of their sanity and rationality. Fortunately, local law enforcement was able to seize a few instances of the harmful substance and link its origin to the Naruhata ward. At that point, the details started to get unsettling. Many people grieved for the victim of the police fire. He was a boy who had reportedly been placed on hold due to a miscommunication. His name was Izuku Midoriya, and facial reconstruction estimated his age to be between 15 and 16. The police were under even more pressure to investigate the death of a teenager who had been imprisoned under false pretenses. However, strange reports of seeing the boy in the Naruhata ward had surfaced. A photograph of a building in the Naruhata ward was on Kenji's desk, but in the background, a now-deceased local hero known as the Crawler was seen carrying a boy who bore a striking resemblance to Izuku Midoriya. Regretfully, the evidence could not yet be confirmed. Kenji sat back in his office chair and huffed. A picture of All Might grinning broadly was displayed on his wall. Like so many others, it inspired him. He had no time to sit around and he had no reason to give up now. A police officer knocked on his door as he sat back up in his chair and started reviewing all of the evidence again. "Come on in," said Kenji. The man with the unkempt beard, the officer, came into the room. "Sir, we have someone in custody that we thought you would like to speak to." Kenji's ears pricked up, but his face stayed expressionless. "Oh, who is it?" Before speaking, the officer hesitated for a moment. "Well, I'm not sure if we can verify his identity yet, but he claims to be Izuku Midoriya." Izuku was frightened the last time he was in an interrogation room. But now he was at ease. He had mentally rehearsed the facade he would present and the justifications he would offer for every scenario his imagination could conjure up more than a dozen times. But he knew better than to overestimate himself. Since they knew that he was at the police station when Tsukachi and his co-workers were killed, he was unable to play the fool. For that, he had a prepared response. Additionally, there was a chance that someone who fit his description would be reported as having been seen in the Naruhata ward. Before his severed body was discovered, there may have even been rumors that he was seen with or near Koichi, also referred to as the Crawler. For that, he had a prepared response. Where was he lodging? For that question, too, he had prepared a response. He was prepared. As planned, the chief of police entered the room and threw off the officer standing watch at the door. He seemed to want complete seclusion. The dog-faced man sat down in his chair across from Izuku and started talking. "First, I must inform you that this interrogation will be recorded for training and archive purposes. Do you consent?" Izuku felt like scoffing. How clever of an amateur. Whether or not he gave his consent, the recording would be retained and distributed to those involved in the investigation. Furthermore, Izuku would only give the detectives and body language experts who examined the recording a suspicious impression if he refused, since the recording was already in progress. Therefore, fervently agreeing would be the only appropriate response. "Yes, yes, of course. I want to aid the investigation however I can," Izuku replied. Kenji remarked, "That's good to hear." Then he set down a manila folder on the table and unfolded it. Izuku saw the folder as nothing more than a collection of photographs. Kenji then sent Izuku a picture of a building in the Naruhata ward, but when he looked more closely, he noticed that the crawler had been spotted carrying a person who resembled him. The chief asked him, "Can you verify this sighting for me?" Izuku gave a head nod. "Yes, he saved me from a robbery at the Marukane department store." Kenji hesitated, as though he wasn't sure what to ask or say next. To put it mildly, Izuku thought that was interesting. As a result, he was unable to promptly confirm his statement because the Naruhata ward authorities did not get in touch with him regarding the robbery. Kenji said, "So you are Izuku Midoriya, correct?" The fact that Kenji phrased his statement as a question amused Izuku, to put it mildly. "Yes, I am," said Izuku simply. "So you were present during the fire at the police station that killed several of my colleagues, including Naomasa Tsukaichi?" asked Kenji. "Yes, that is correct," confirmed Izuku. Kenji pushed the photo of Izuku's sighting in Naruhata aside to reveal a picture of a charred corpse. "Then explain this to me," he said. The sight of it made Izuku look ill. When Kenji started to say, "These were your verified remains, Izuku, so how did you survive? And how did you end up in the Naruhata ward?" Izuku leaned back in his chair. He looked shaky, a little unkempt, and tense. A group of villains raided the police station. They were after Detective Tsukaichi because he was close to exposing their entire operation of flooding the streets of Tokyo with a drug called Trigger. When they saw me they were going to kill me, but I managed to convince them that I could be useful alive, Izuku stated. The final portion of Izuku's testimony made Kenji tense. "So, how did you manage to convince a group of villains to spare your life?" Izuku let out a sigh and cast a shamed glance down. "Growing up I've always wanted to be a pro-hero, but unfortunately I was born without a quirk. But I've always been a huge fan of pro-heroes, so I kept a notebook with details of every pro-hero's quirks. So I managed to convince the villains that I could work for them. Afterwards, one of the villains used their quirk to burn down the police station after another one of the villains used his quirk to make a body double of me to throw investigators. I managed to escape them and I fled to Naruhata, but they tracked me down and brought me back here. They also." Izuku's tone faltered. He looked like he was about to cry, and his face was full of guilt and sadness. But Kenji had to continue. Everything was adding up so far. Kenji shifted a photograph to the side to show Koichi's severed body in the restroom stall and questioned, "So, were these same villains responsible for the crawler's murder?" Izuku had to fight the urge to throw up. His face lost its color and his blood turned cold. The quirkless boy could only confirm by nodding his head. Kenji shifted the image to the side, exposing the charred remains of Popstep, a popular cosplayer and local Naruhata vigilante hero, and Makoto Tsukaichi's head in the toilet. "And they were responsible for these deaths as well?" Kenji asked. Izuku nodded once more, but his face was still flushed and his expression conveyed how sick the images were making him feel. Kenji questioned him, "Were you present during each murder?" Izuku gave a headshake. "No, I just know because they bragged about it." "I see," said Kenji. Izuku thought his expression was a little strange. Additionally, he didn't like how flat his response was. The quirkless boy anticipated that the dogman would ask a follow-up question that pressed the point. Why hadn't he inquired as to which villains were involved and how they accomplished it, since he was already aware that Izuku was in Naruhata when they were killed? There was no sense in it. "I have some information for you, it's extremely urgent. May I have a pen?" Izuku responded. "Sure," Kenji replied, taking a pen out of his pocket and giving it to Izuku. On the manila folder, Izuku then wrote an address. "I managed to break away from them for good once the villains left to enact the next phase of their plan, which was to kidnap one of my closest friends and a student at UA named Katsuki Bakugo. They want to recruit him and make him do awful things like they made me do," Izuku shouted. Kenji's face became gravely serious. He got out of his chair right away and left the interrogation room to do what Izuku thought was to notify the local authorities and the pro-hero agencies. Kenji returned to the interrogation room after what seemed like an eternity. "I contacted as many pro-hero agencies that I could, including All Mights. They're currently investigating an attack on UA that ended with the abduction of Katsuki Bakugo, but rest assured that we will work tirelessly to bring him back home," Kenji told Izuku. The quirkless boy gave a grateful smile. Thank you so much. I knew that coming here wouldn't be a mistake." The words, "Don't thank me just yet," Kenji said. Izuku looked at him disbelievingly. "In the interest of fairness, I decided to turn the questioning over to a man whom your associates took everything away from. He has gathered more evidence than me and my investigators have, and he is very interested in speaking with you." The canine-faced chief of police left the room after Kenji finished speaking. Izuku's blood actually turned to ice when a man entered a room a moment later. Knuckle Duster was the man who walked into the room. The time for truth was today. Knuckle Duster would always remember what he had seen on that terrible day. The bomb that killed Popstep when it exploded. He had hoped that she had somehow escaped the blast using her quirk, but the police discovered burned remains strewn all over the wreckage. Nevertheless, he clung to hope. That boy was very persistent and never gave up, so Koichi must have figured out everything he thought. Perhaps he had important information that he would be willing to share because he was also keen to notice details that most people would overlook. Knuckle Duster would have to inform his comrade in arms that they had lost their partner and close confidant, which would be regrettable, but they could work through it together. They could go on. Then he received the news. Police officers recorded Koichi's visit to the coffee shop. After being wheeled out of the coffee shop on a gurney, 2 bodies were covered with sheets. Knuckle Duster's face was smeared with dismay, and he pushed through the yellow tape and insisted on being given permission to examine the body. But Sir after pushing him aside, Knuckle Duster looked. He was horrified to see that it was Koichi's severed head, which had been positioned correctly but had obviously been cut off from the rest of his body. He quickly came to the conclusion that if Koichi had been killed at the rendezvous location where he was meant to meet Makoto, then Knuckle Duster pushed the first responders aside, including the one who tried to tackle him at the waist, and looked under the other gurney's sheets to verify his suspicions. Regretfully, he was correct. Makoto had been decapitated as well. Emotionally overwhelmed, Knuckle Duster collapsed to his knees and pounded his fists on the sidewalk until blood trickled from his knuckles. Knuckle Duster was distraught even though the first responders tried to get him to stand so they could bandage his hands and take him off the property. The worst news, however, was still to come. A few hours later, the burned remains of a woman were discovered, according to the local news. Her identity was confirmed by a DNA test to be Tamao Oguro, the daughter of Knuckle Duster. The Naruhata vigilantes were aware that Knuckle Duster's daughter was used as a host by Kuen, also referred to as Queen Bee. They wanted to save her by removing the bee from her body, but they would never be able to do so because the host body had been burned alive and 2 of the members had been killed. Or so he had believed. It was shocking to learn that the remains that had been positively identified as those of Tamao Oguro had actually died from strangulation rather than from burns or smoke inhalation. Additionally, the female victim had most likely been sexually assaulted prior to her death, according to a vaginal swab. Knuckle Duster became the one person with all the answers because of the unfolding story that encapsulated the Naruhata ward. Izuku Midoriya. Knuckle Duster growled in his voice. His clenched jaws gave the impression that he was doing everything he could to prevent himself from breaking. Tell me everything. Tell me where the bastards responsible are. Izuku seemed anxious and tense, and his gaze strayed a little. I can't. Boom. Knuckle Duster slammed his fist so hard against the table that it shattered in 2 and clattered on the interrogation room floor. In order to effectively prevent Kenji from interfering, Knuckle Duster picked up a chair and positioned it beneath the doorknob so that it could not fully turn before Kenji could try to defuse the situation. Izuku yelled in agony as the Naruhata vigilante stepped forward, grabbed him by the collar of his shirt, and slammed him against the wall. Stop playing games with me. Where are they? Where are the ones responsible? I told you, I don't know anything. Kenji and a few other policemen started beating on the door as forcefully as they could. Knuckle Duster overheard Kenji tell one of the officers to get a battering ram from inside. Knuckle Duster put one hand on Izuku's wrist and the other on his shoulder, saying, I don't have time for this. You have 5 seconds to tell me something valuable or else I'm breaking your arm. What? 1. I told you already I don't know. 2. You can't do this, aren't you supposed to be a hero? 3. Kenji and his men stood outside the door, ready to use the battering ram. I barely escaped them with my life. Why won't you believe me? 4. With a loud thud, the door flew open as Kenji and his men pressed the ram against it. Kenji yelled, Knuckle Duster, stop it, to him. 5. All for One used me as bait. There was a brief silence while Knuckle Duster let go of Izuku. All for One used me as bait to draw the Naruhata vigilantes out as well as Kuen, but I swear that I didn't know. They change hideouts frequently, so I don't know where All for One is now, but I already told Kenji about their next move. Izuku pleaded desperately and frantically. He dropped to his hands and knees and lowered his head to the floor. Please. That's all I know. The darkness that veiled Knuckle Duster's face persisted despite his apparent satisfaction with the response. The Naruhata vigilante left the interrogation room without saying anything more, sweeping past Kenji and the other officers who had entered just in time to hear Izuku's confession. Kenji went up to Izuku and put a helping hand on his shoulder. "Are you all right?" After Izuku slapped Kenji's hand away, he got to his feet. "You knew about this, didn't you? Why would you leave me alone with him?" Izuku yelled. "No, As he bounded out of the interrogation room, Izuku growled, "I gave you your information already, so leave me alone." But before he could do so, Kenji called out to him. "Where are you going to go? You don't have anywhere to hide and you are being hunted by extremely dangerous villains." "Let me enroll you into the witness protection program," Kenji replied. Izuku came to a complete halt. He intended to watch All for One's scheme fail in his face by using Knuckle Duster's brutal interrogation as a pretext to depart and meet up with the other members of the League. But he would never get there without dependable transportation. "Okay," Izuku said, turning to Kenji. "Take me to All Might." This is what being Katsuki Bakugo has been like. One day, one instant, and everything was different. That one unattractive character with the chicken legs and the submissive manner, the one who could hardly make eye contact and spoke to you in a timid voice. A bullet did not kill him. Bakugo was advised by his mother to go visit him in the hospital. "He's your friend, isn't he?" Bakugo, however, was much too arrogant for that. He was annoyed by that little pipsqueak's toughness. Had he been playing the part of the weak guy all along? Meanwhile, a third-rate villain had taken him hostage. Deku was terrified and imprisoned inside a slime monster, unable to escape and slowly dying from suffocation. In fact, he had survived a bullet that had come within inches of taking his life. In addition to surviving, he fully recovered. He appeared as though nothing had occurred, spoke as though nothing had occurred, and walked as though nothing had occurred. Katsuki, meanwhile, was drowning in a pit of weakness. With all his heart and soul, he felt that he was unique. His quirk was incredibly strong. It had not been seen since Endeavor, also known as Enji Todoroki, and it had such unadulterated destructive power. This positive feedback loop gave rise to his superiority complex because he was only exposed to praise. But a slime villain had humbled him. Another blow was delivered before he had a chance to comprehend what had happened to him. Deku's death. He had no idea why it had struck him so forcefully. He initially attributed it to shock. It must have been because it happened so quickly, and nothing else. He would recover and move on in due time. He was unable to. Why? His eyes filled with tears. Why am I crying over this? Would Deku be missed by him? Was he interested in him? It was unclear. He had no idea how to make sense of his emotions. He therefore led a kind of hazy life. His classmates took note of his serious demeanor. To put it mildly, it was unexpected. The bad boy and school bully killed the boy he tormented more than anyone else. This caused some of his classmates to turn against him. They thought Bakugo just missed having a punching bag nearby. As a result, he was attacked on school property by one of his own thugs after class. He might have wanted to be the new top dog because he felt vulnerable and, in a sense, smelled blood. He then leapt on him. Like Deku, Katsuki also took a beating. He couldn't help but ask himself as he lay on the ground, bruised, looking up at the wild blue sky. Did you see that, Deku? He had learned that Deku's mother had overdosed and was in a coma. Katsuki's mother encouraged him to at least send her a note of well wishes because she was devastated. His response was, "Sure, I'll do that." Despite his inability to be sentimental, he made every effort to honor a boy he detested and acknowledge that he missed him. When he arrived in the UA actually, it was more of the same. His classmates were unsure of how to interpret him because he lived in a fog every day. He didn't say much, and his eyes were slightly gloomy. However, he was always energized when it came time to compete. He lost his temper as soon as the competition subsided, but it was like a switch had been flipped. He noticed that he was growing closer to some of his classmates, like the boisterous and brazen Eijiro, who liked Katsuki's own unwavering will in combat. When a group known as the League of Villains unexpectedly attacked the school grounds, their bond was solidified. Katsuki stepped up to the plate and gave it his all to slow down a beast that he knew was far more powerful than himself, even though a nomu, an all-powerful beast, ran roughshod on the gullible students. Katsuki's tenacity inspired Eijiro to follow suit, and the two of them worked together to repel the monster until All Might came to their aid. Despite their mutual suffering, the two students were able to smile at each other as they lay on the ground, severely battered, bloodied, and bruised. Or it might have been because of it. The two of them became inseparable after that. Their brotherhood also had an unexpected addition. Ochako Uraraka, a girl. He saw that she seemed to think highly of the two of them, as though she was amazed by their relationship. Her stares annoyed Katsuki at first, but when he fought her at the sports festival, he discovered that she shared his desire to win, and he respected that. He went all out for her as a result, and prevailed. Regarding Katsuki's choice to be harsh with her, Eijiro had mixed feelings. Although he thought a man should always give it his all, he also felt that a man should never hit a lady. Although it was quite the puzzle, Katsuki provided him with the answer to his query. Would a villain pull their punches on her? All that had to be said was that. Shoto Todoroki and Katsuki Bakugo engaged in the decisive battle. Everyone was watching them because they were the two favorites. The battle was fierce, as one might expect. Strategically, Katsuki's explosion was used to melt Shoto's ice. Katsuki used his quirk to speed up his movement, making him more difficult to hit, even when Shoto went on the defensive and tried to build an ice wall. He wanted to get closer to Shoto, who knew exactly what Katsuki was planning. One amazing move altered the course of the battle, but neither side wanted to concede even an inch. Like a top, Katsuki whirled around, using his quirk to increase both his terminal velocity and destructive force. He essentially transformed himself into a terrible, makeshift tornado. Through the devastation, Shoto heard his fierce classmate growl at him, "Use your full power," as he tore through his ice defense like paper match. Shoto was surprised. Thus, Katsuki was aware that he was hiding his actual strength. Shoto had a deep-seated desire for victory, but if it meant losing his soul, it would be meaningless. He saw it that way, anyway. Thus, he refrained from letting loose the fire. He lost as a result. Katsuki was incensed. It wasn't a win at all to win like that. During the medal ceremony, All Might had to hold him and put a muzzle on his face. He couldn't help it, even though he had been practically frothing at the mouth. He secretly aspired to be the greatest and to triumph, so it infuriated him that the person he identified as his main opponent did not take their battle seriously. He did, however, witness it in action at one point. Katsuki joined Best Jeanist as an intern following the festival. Katsuki's reputation as a bad boy was something he wished to alter. He wanted the brash young man to behave like a gentleman and to be dressed in his image. He had been barking up the wrong tree, unfortunately. He encountered the threat that had been wreaking havoc on the streets one night when Katsuki slipped away from him. Hero killer Stain. Katsuki stopped him before he could harm another professional hero. At first, Katsuki's offensive rage surprised Stain. The sports festival champion was difficult to follow because he moved around the air with little effort thanks to his explosions. Nevertheless, Stain was able to nick Katsuki with one of his blades because he had cunning and experience on his side. Stain started, "I don't like killing kids, but you have no future as a hero." Katsuki fell to the ground in a heap, and Stain liked the blood on his knife. He had no idea why he was immobile. Fortunately, Shoto and Tenya were able to save him in time. Since Stain had injured his brother, Tenya was out for blood. He attacked rashly and interfered with Shoto's attempts to assist him by using long-range ice attacks. Furious at Tenya's lack of poise, Katsuki yelled at Shoto to use his fire quirk to keep Stain on the defensive and his ice quirk to separate Tenya from Stain. Shoto was reluctant to use his fire quirk, though, and Katsuki finally yelled at him. "If you won't use your quirk to save a classmate, then what good are you?" The spark that started the fire was those words. He finally used his quirk to its fullest extent, and Katsuki was able to regain movement just in time. While Shoto held off Stain, Katsuki's first move was straightforward. Slap Tenya with some common sense. Katsuki shouted at Tenya at the top of his lungs while grabbing him by the collar. "You're supposed to let me be the hot-headed one. Stop trying to make me be the voice of reason." Then Tenya suddenly jolted out of his daze. The three of them attacked Stain and took him down with a combination attack. Shoto cooled the radiators on Tenya's legs with his ice. Tenya was further boosted by Katsuki's nitro-like explosion as he boosted himself in the direction of Stain. Then he delivered a roundhouse kick to Stain's head. What he called the super recipro extend was sufficient to render Stain unconscious. Fortunately, they were able to stop Stain's rampage, and even though the hospital's chief of police reprimanded them the following day, he chose to overlook it out of fairness. Katsuki had experienced what it was like to be a real hero for the first time, and he found it enjoyable. Additionally, he gained knowledge that he would never acknowledge. A hero does not have to win by himself, even though it is true that they must work hard to succeed. He was saved by his classmates, and neither his ego nor his pride were wounded. They were completely taken aback when he actually thanked them. Katsuki growled at Shoto and Tenya, saying, "If you tell anyone that I thanked you too, you're both dead." Nevertheless, he kept thinking about the little pipsqueak who taught about being a hero and how Katsuki was just a bully in the back of his mind. If you keep picking on people, then I'll never forgive you. TCH. Katsuki cleared his mind of the unpleasant recollection. I did what you would do, so do you forgive me now? Pleading with his friend who passed away for forgiveness. That was the experience of being Katsuki Bakugo. Kenji's patrol car had Izuku sitting in the passenger seat. He could hear Kenji's radio providing real-time updates on the villain attack during the drive. It seems that before Tamura and the other League members chose to interrupt their brief training session, Classes 1A and 1B were training in a forest lodge. Numerous reports on the condition and well-being of the students were available along the route. Fortunately, at least for Kenji, none of the students' injuries were life-threatening or severe. He was concerned, however, that reinforcements to help the students in their hour of need had not yet come. The police were instructed to set up a perimeter so that the students could flee, help the injured, and keep the criminals inside. Izuku inquired, "How far away are we now?" Instead of coming across as impatient, he did his best to sound concerned. The distance was about a half an hour away, give or take, Kenji stated. They hadn't even left the city limits of Tokyo yet, so it was difficult for Izuku to tell, but they soon found themselves off the road. However, at that moment, Kenji's radio was inundated with news of Bakugo, the sports festival winner, narrowly defeating Muscular, a very strong and dangerous killer, in single combat. Since Bakugo courageously entered the battle despite knowing that the villains had come to kidnap him, there were numerous eyewitnesses to the fierce battle. His classmates tried to shield him in his weaker state, but a villain managed to capture him and turn Bakugo into a tiny, marble-like object. It must have been one of Tamura's new recruits, Izuku reasoned. Again, what was his name? Compress, Mr. Yes, that was it. Even though Bakugo was greatly outmatched, that was still a remarkable accomplishment. He was never one to surrender easily. The most shocking report of all, however, was when a panicked policeman yelled over the radio that the heroes have arrived. A sly smile appeared on Izuku's face. Kenji stepped on the accelerator. The practice area had become a battlefield. And one man in particular was very unhappy. This just will not do. He saw amazing mayhem and stunning carnage when he got to the training forest. The tapestry of bloodshed was exquisite. To him the Scream Symphony was like an opera, and it was most glorious. However, the appearance of those vile heroes spoiled the performance. Tamura and the other League members had nearly reached their goal. Bakugo was compressed into a spherical object by Mr. Compress using his quirk, and the group had almost emerged from the forest. Almost. The slippery hero Edgeshot and his multi-purpose quirk, Foldabody, delivered a lightning-fast sting to the back of Kurogiri's neck, blinding him. When the gullible villains tried to flee, the cunning shinobi was able to ambush them. However, they were unaware that the pro-hero had put them in danger. Kamui Woods. Edgeshot yelled, and the cunning pro-hero emerged from the shadowy emptiness of the forest and firmly established himself in the earth as quickly as the villains heard his name. He buried his fists in the ground and conjured up a swarm of vines, trapping the gullible villains inside a wooden cage. The targets have been captured. A flash of fire erupted, lighting up the pitch-black woodland. To prevent the villains from trying to escape their prison, if they were even able to do so, it surrounded the improvised wooden cage. The Tamura hissed, "Endeavor." It was, in fact, the number 2 hero, standing with Edgeshot and Kamui Woods in triumph. "Release the boy at once, or you will all be burned to cinders." A villain would believe that the pro-hero was bluffing if they made a threat like that. But because of Endeavor's reputation, the League had to take his threat seriously. Endeavor would do whatever it took to accomplish his objectives, even if it meant endangering a hostage or an innocent bystander. That's what his reputation implied, anyway. "Damn," exclaimed Tamura. "Damn, damn, damn. How could they have reacted that fast? Were they deceived? Who did it? Did anyone else know about their non-existent plan? Who was Judas? Compress, give him the kid." "All right." Mr. Compress threw a red sphere in Endeavor's direction, and Endeavor grasped it. After he set the sphere back on the ground, it started to glow whitely and, after a brief moment, it released Bakugo, who appeared sitting on the ground. He seemed perplexed at first, but the only right conclusion was that he had been saved when he turned to see Endeavor, Kamui Woods, Edgeshot, and the villains in their wooden cage encircled by a ring of fire. Bakugo whispered, "I suppose I should thank you," but only Endeavor could hear him, even though I had it under control. Endeavor laughed at what the boy had said. He then smirked at him as he turned to face him. "You remind me a lot of myself." Bakugo said, "TCH, I've heard that one before, and got to his feet. A group of paramedics showed up to treat Bakugo's injuries and escort him to safety. Police started to encroach on the area, removing checkpoints and gradually enlarging the perimeter until the criminals had nowhere to go. The League of Villains seemed to have ended with this. This would no take action. An angel of darkness swooped down from the sky, a tall, dark figure in a black suit darker than the Grim Reaper's cloak. Because of the scars and blemishes from his previous fight with All Might, the top hero, his face was unrecognizable. While the pro heroes, Endeavor, Edgeshot, and Kamui Woods, watched with fear etched on their faces, civilians gazed up at him with pale faces. The man, the boogeyman about whom all professional heroes had heard tales, the only antagonist who had ever pushed All Might to the edge of his comfort zone, had returned. Most people thought he had keeled over and died of old age because he had been in hiding for so long. But here he was, physically. The police pulled out their guns and started shooting, but the legendary villain laughed at their pointless attempts as the bullets bounced off him like paper match. Gnats. All for One summoned a gust of wind with a single, powerful blow to his hand, sending half a dozen police officers flying backwards. The officers would have undoubtedly died in the fall if it weren't for Mount Lady's quick thinking, which allowed her to grow larger so she could safely catch them. Hold your fire. Endeavor commanded the rest of the contingent. This isn't your fight, fall back. Even though the police force knew they couldn't handle this fight, they followed orders. Outside the boundaries of what might be the last conflict between the heroes and the League of Villains, Mount Lady persisted in escorting the police and any remaining students she had discovered. The rest of the League started to feel relieved to see their great leader, All for One, inside the wooden cage. Seeing him in action especially pleased Tamura. Sadly, though, he would not have the opportunity. In any case, up close. Those confined to the wooden cage suddenly started to convulse. Their mouth oozed black gunk until it filled their entire being with nothingness. Endeavor gritted his teeth in frustration as the heroes gasped at what they had seen. Oh no. They were very near, they had the League in the palm of their hands, yet they quickly let them go. Now then, All for One said, taking off his immaculate three-piece suit, shall we begin? Kenji's police vehicle pulled up. As soon as he got out of his car, the triage officer welcomed him and rattled off a list of updates to the canine officer. So Endeavor, Edgeshot, and Kamui Woods are locked in battle right now with All for One? Asked Kenji. The triage officer confirmed by nodding his head. And the rest of the League escaped. How? This update made Izuku furrow his brow. We don't know, sir, but it seems that All for One somehow teleported them away. In contemplation, Kenji put his hand under his chin. Do you have any idea where he'd teleport them to? He asked, turning to face Izuku. Izuku gave a shrug. Maybe their headquarters. We already have men positioned outside of their HQ, sir, and I was just told moments ago that they have not sighted any of the villains there, the officer in charge said. Kenji started to say, it appears that they have played their hand well. Nevertheless, he exuded confidence. But we have aces of our own. Izuku and the triage officer looked at Kenji with disbelief. Aces? Izuku started to reflect. All Might would be among the aces, if he had to guess. Who are the other aces, then? Kenji said, take me to the triage station, right away, sir, duly noted the officer. You too, Izuku was told by Kenji. Izuku remarked, I'll be fine here. He knew that there would be some characters at the triage station that he didn't want to see, so he was determined to stay behind. Unfortunately for him, though, it appeared that Kenji was unwilling to move even a single inch. Kenji remarked, I insist. I must assure your safety. Izuku let out a sigh and trailed behind Kenji to the triage station, which was a part of the perimeter set up by the police, paramedics, and first responders to ensure the safety of any emergency personnel, as well as any potential bystanders and the heroes. Both reporters and civilians were trying to look past in order to observe the battle that was going on, and it was very crowded. They were literally praying for the heroes to prevail, and Izuku couldn't hold it against them. It was time for All for One to receive his just desserts. Ironically, the very boy he so desperately sought to enlist in the League of Villains would end up killing him as a result of all his schemes and the events he had set in motion to recruit Izuku. Izuku started things off by telling the police about their plan, which is why the pro-heroes were fighting him in the first place. Justice would be done at last. Deku? Izuku turned to hear his name called by a voice that sounded all too familiar. It was a boy with blonde hair and bright red eyes, covered in bandages from his fight with Muscular, the villain. His eyes were wide as he walked toward Izuku, as though he had seen a ghost. He was also Izuku's friend from childhood, Keikachin? They and everyone else in the area lost their footing when the ground shook abruptly. What on earth was happening? With a blast of wind escaping from the palm of his hand, All for One asked, "Do you really think that you have what it takes to stand against me?" Endeavor was blown onto his back by the shockwave, but Edgeshot and Kamui Woods were quick enough to get out of its path just in time. "I think it is about time we finish this, All for One." The renowned masked vigilante of the Naruhata Ward appeared out of the sky like a meteorite bound for the surface of the earth. With his right fist cocked back, he was prepared to strike All for One in the face. And he succeeded in doing so. A human-sized crater was formed on the ground when All for One was knocked out of the sky and onto the ground by the force of his blow. The three professional heroes could only watch in shock at what they had just seen as the ground below trembled violently from the impact. The pro heroes moved toward All for One's body, assuming it was safe to talk because he was still on the ground. Knuckle Duster was asked by Endeavor, "What took you so long?" "My ride was late, you know how he gets," Knuckle Duster said. Looking up into the night sky, Endeavor did so. He couldn't see him from where he was. Endeavor said, "He's still flying in circles up there?" "Yep, he insisted on keeping a bird's eye of view," Knuckle Duster informed him. "HMPH, he's just lazy," sneered Endeavor. All for One's finger twitched as Kamui Woods started to erect a wooden cage around his body, and Knuckle Duster realized instantly that they had fallen into his trap. Everyone get ba, however, it was too late. A single blow to the back of their necks sent Knuckle Duster, Endeavor, Edgeshot, and Kamui Woods tumbling to the ground in a heap faster than the eye could follow. Standing over their bodies, All for One used his hand to crack his neck. Overclock. A quirk that accelerates the user's brain perceptions to superhuman levels, making the world appear to be moving in slow motion. I had forgotten about the quirk I had stolen from you until your face reminded me of it, oh wow. Or should I say, Knuckle Duster. All for One walked up to the unconscious bodies of the professional heroes and covered them with his hand. However, their bodies miraculously floated into the air and sped out of sight towards the triage station before he could use his air cannon to finish them off. Upon closer examination, there was absolutely no miracle. The professional hero's clothing had been pulled by it. To prevent it from breaking under the force of the pull, denim fabric was interwoven and tied off. It was only Best Jeanist who could have achieved such mastery. You take it from here, wearing his Golden Age hero uniform, a big, burly man with a physique that some people believe to be the best ever seen entered the scene with a fierce, determined expression. "All Might. It has been a long time, Toshinori." "Not long enough, Shigaraki. Let's skip the pleasantries and go right into it, shall we?" As his right arm started to grow and swell in a hideous way, All for One said. "My thoughts exactly," All Might roared, starting to muster the last of his remaining strength. He genuinely thought that if he looked deep enough within himself, he could defeat All for One with a single blow, even though he had passed his quirk on to a worthy successor and what was left of his own power were embers of a once raging inferno. "Before we begin, I must inform you that I know that you have an ace in the sky, watching us all like a hawk. Regardless, I will still tell you my little secret. My true successor shall be your undoing." "True successor? You shall face him soon enough. Just know that it was thanks to your weakness that he fell right into my hands, Toshinori. Spear-like bones, airwalk, hypertrophy, strength enhancer ×3, kinetic booster ×4, and spring-like limbs. Those were the best combination of quirks available to All for One. Let us end this, Toshinori. Farewell, All for One." The trees surrounding them were uprooted when the two giants collided and their fists exploded. The Earth's crust was scarred by a crater the size of a fallen meteor, and everything within a 20-mile radius was blown away by gale force winds. United States of Smash. The unexpected aftershock knocked the onlookers off their feet, but they were able to regain their bearings back at the triage station. Izuku got back to his feet and looked directly at Katsuki. Until Eijiro and Ochako, who had come to see how Bakugo was doing, were in awe of Izuku, they remained silent for a while. "Hey, aren't you?" The pedestrians were flung backwards by gale force winds that were summoned from the battle between All Might and All for One. Some of them nearly flew into the air before Mount Lady and Best Jeanist used their quirks to save them. Izuku stood up again and saw that, of all people, Bakugo had come to see how he was doing. Why was he suddenly being so nice? Deku. Bakugo could not think of anything to say. There was only one question that flooded his mind all the time. How are you still alive? Izuku felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to throw up. When he opened his mouth, black miasma poured out and covered his body, causing him to double over. In a desperate attempt to free himself, Bakugo tried everything, but nothing worked. Desperately, he roared, "Help! Someone! Please! Help!" Both Eijiro and Ochako attempted to assist him in releasing Izuku, but it seemed as though their fingers simply slid through him. It was already too late when Kenji showed up with Best Jeanist, a revived Kamui Woods, and Edge Shot. Izuku had left. Bakugo slammed both of his fists into the ground, fell to his knees, and let out a heartbreaking cry. At an undisclosed location, Izuku fell to the ground and started coughing and hacking. It seemed that he would never get used to that unsettling quirk, especially since it always took him by surprise. The quirkless boy noticed breaking news flashing on the bottom of a television monitor that was mounted on the wall when he looked up. He appeared to be in some kind of sports bar, and the people seated at the bar by the TV were members of the League of Villains. In any case, what was left of them? There were Kurogiri, Dabi, Tamura, Twice, Spinner, and Mr. Compress. Muscular, Mustard, Magna, and Moonfish had all been taken into custody. How unfortunate. Staring at the news broadcast in shock, the rest of the league fell silent. All Might was able to finally defeat All for One in a single powerful blow. Tamura turned to face Izuku after slamming his fist into the table and getting to his feet. Tamura removed his glove and walked toward Izuku, saying, "The heroes knew where we were going to strike and when we were going to strike. Not only that, but they also knew where our headquarters were." "Izuku," he kept moving in his direction, "did you betray All for One?" Then Izuku started laughing hysterically. The laughter was unadulterated, unrestrained, and uncompromising. Tamura became even more irritated as his voice filled the bar and bounced off the walls, causing a vein to emerge from his forehead. "I will take that as a yes." Tamura rushed straight at Izuku, who was still laughing uncontrollably. But before he could reach him, Toga rushed over to Izuku's side and encircled him with both of her arms. With a tackle that resulted in a harmless barrel roll across the ground, she was able to quickly move both herself and him out of danger. Toga helped Izuku stand up and started to dust off his clothes while he kept laughing. Tamura yelled, "Toga, what are you doing?" at her. "Wait, Tamura," was yelled twice. Twice shouted, "Fight to the death," as well. Izuku looked around the room and his laughter subsided. Kurogiri did not move. As usual, his face was unreadable. Dabi seemed almost bored, and he seemed remarkably unperturbed and unconcerned. However, he had consistently been the hardest League of Villains member to read. Where were his allegiances? Both Spinner and Mr. Compress got up from their chairs and positioned themselves toward Izuku. They undoubtedly waited for Tamura's orders. Mr. Compress sulked around the edge, so as not to get too far away from Tamura's position, and Spinner had a hand shading the hilt of one of his katana blades. Twice appeared to be, to put it mildly, somewhat conflicted. He was prepared to let justice be served on Izuku in the event that he was found guilty of betraying All for One, but he also didn't want to watch his fellow league members destroy one another. Fortunately for Izuku, he already knew what card to play in his hand because everything that had happened up to this point had been his design. Izuku laughed and said, "Am I the only one who noticed it? Really? This is rich." To Izuku, Tamura spat, "What's so damn funny?" His voice was laced with strong poison. "Isn't it obvious? All for One wanted to be captured, it's a message," Izuku shouted. He caught a glimpse of Dabi glancing at him out of the corner of his eye before returning his focus to the TV screen. "What? If All for One had a plan like that, then I would have known about it. Do you really think that?" Izuku gave Tamura a finger wag. Izuku made fun of Tamura in a sing-song voice, saying, "Poor Tamura, unable to pick up on context clues." Tamura's glare would have instantly killed the oddball boy if appearances could kill. "While you were out on your useless excursion, I gathered valuable clues at the police station headquarters in Tokyo. I even spoke with the chief of police himself, Kenji Suragame. So, I already know who the chief of police is. Why would that matter to me? It's a public record. And what clues could you have picked up at the police station? So, I know how to get to him. I have the entire layout memorized. It wouldn't be hard for us to capture Kenji and initiate a hostage exchange." Tamura was surprised by Izuku's scheme. A hostage exchange? Izuku gave a head nod. The city's beloved chief of police in exchange for All for One. "And what if they don't accept our deal? Then we ask them to please kindly release another prisoner for us, or we kill him. Is that a simple enough plan for you to follow?" As though enlightened, Tamura's eyes softened. At last he knew what the boy in front of him was thinking. He was shrewd, clever, and calculating. In his insane mind, he planned ahead several steps. The boy had a keen mind. He was clinically insane, though. He had a cunning plan, but it was illogical. Would anyone want to be captured and traded? There was no sense in that. This child was lying, I'm afraid. The pro-heroes responded so quickly because he must have given the police information while he was at the station. To put it bluntly, Tamura said, "You're insane, and I don't know what All for One saw in you." Upon hearing Tamura yell their names, Spinner, Compress, they started moving right away. Toga, the femme fatale with a butcher knife, was protecting Izuku when Spinner pulled out his katana blade and leapt high into the air, prepared to kill her. While Twice was yelling in the background for them to stop and desist and to tear each other apart at the same time, Mr. Compress tried to approach from behind in order to ambush Izuku from behind. Spinner and Mr. Compress were forced to retreat in order to avoid being burned alive and dying of agony when a pillar of blue flames suddenly appeared around Izuku and Toga, creating a makeshift barrier around them. "Tamura," Dabi said as he rose from his seat. His face was the same as always, bored and uninterested, but there was a flash of interest and insight in his eyes. He had been paying attention to Izuku's words and had pieced everything together on his own. "Shut up for a moment." Tamura was tense, but before he could move another finger, blue flames surrounded him and erupted from the earth, preventing him from leaving its boundaries. "You," Dabi said, turning to look at Izuku, his emerald irises devoid of all emotion. "You betrayed All for One," was a statement rather than a query. In jest, Izuku lifted both of his arms, guilty as charged. "You little," Tamura said as the flames around him intensified and drew closer to him. Dabi repeated, "Shut up," without looking at him. Dabi stated bluntly, "All for One recruited you, but he destroyed your life in order to do it." Izuku gave a nod of confirmation, guilty on both counts. "Oh snap!" was yelled twice. Twice exclaimed, "I knew it all along, as well." Dabi questioned her, "Toga, you knew about this too, why didn't you tell me?" He wore a hurt look on his face. Toga gave him a sheepish smile, "I'm sorry, it slipped my mind. Regardless, I knew something was fishy the day that All for One had his sights set on you. Everything happened too sudden to be mere coincidence. I'm honestly surprised that you hadn't figured it out sooner, but maybe it was easier for me to tell since I was on the outside looking in," Dabi thought. To put it mildly, Izuku was shocked, but he was also very happy. Dabi didn't talk much, if at all, but he was very perceptive. He had the ability to read people, read a room, and manage a situation. Izuku was aware that he needed to use all available methods to recruit him. Dabi's intervention was purely coincidental, but he assumed someone would. It was probably Kurogiri, but it was ideal for it to have been Dabi. The two of them reaching a consensus was an uncommon occurrence. "With that said, you're lying about your plan, aren't you? You don't really want to release All for One, do you?" He could therefore see right through him. "No, my plan was to use Kenji's hostage negotiation as a distraction while we broke inside of Tartarus and released the most terrifying villain of all, Stain." Dabi's expression briefly changed from one of surprise to their typical expressionless one. That was his only negotiating tool. Izuku could also see it in Spinner's relaxed posture and focused standing. Hero killer Stain was the only person Dabi had any admiration for. Izuku felt bad about Tamura's poor treatment of him. Stain's potential was wasted when he could have been a valuable ally. Even though it was a waste, it wasn't a wrong that couldn't be made right by better people. He was certain that there would be at least one League member who felt the same way. Though he inspired many, Stain was a very divisive figure. Izuku saw a chance, but Tamura was envious of him. "I see," Tamura said, as the blue flames that had surrounded him broke up into innocuous embers that flickered out on the sports bar's wooden panels, and the fire that had encircled Toga and Izuku had gone out. Dabi asked him, "Kurogiri, what is the worst-case scenario in all of this?" Kurogiri paused to consider his response. Izuku successfully captures Kenji Suragame, but fails to negotiate an exchange. Instead, they double down on not negotiating, and his distraction fails. Thus, when he attempts to break the hero killer Stain out of Tartarus, he along with the remainder of the League are captured. Dabi gave a headshake. "Wrong. The worst-case scenario would be that we all die, and the League of Villains flame out before we ever reach our peak. What you described would be pleasant by comparison," Dabi replied. "I don't care one way or another, but even I can tell that All for One fought All Might so that the League could remain intact. He also must have known that what he did to Izuku would bite him in the ass one day, otherwise he let a little boy outthink him, in which case that wouldn't make him much of a symbol of evil." Dabi's statement clearly flustered Tamura. Was it intentional for All for One to be captured? Was a peculiar pipsqueak like Izuku really able to outsmart him? So, let's all make our decision now, and then we go our own separate ways. Got it? Like a schoolgirl intoxicated by her first crush, Toga put her arms around Izuku's neck and held on to his body. There was never any question of her loyalty. Spinner said nothing, but he started to approach Izuku's side slowly. Even though he hadn't said anything yet, his silence was very telling. He had a particular admiration for one man, Stain. His militant garb and the flowing red scarf he wore, which Stain also wore, were clear indicators. While Dabi headed for Izuku, Kurogiri stayed put while Mr. Compress started to make his way back to Tamura's side. I am a neutral party, but consider this bar to be a safe haven for any of you to come back to should you need to. I only ask that if any of you were to cross paths here to please abstain from fighting, or else I will be forced to warp you out of the premises. Tamura was inconsolable. He felt deceived. He and All for One had taken all of these jerks into their fold, and this was their way of paying them back? There will be hell to pay one day. Today, however, would not be that day. You're all a disgrace to the League, Tamura spit out. He started to head for the exit, and Mr. Compress followed, but not before turning to address the rest of his now former allies. And that boy won't lead you anywhere but to your graves, if you're lucky, he said. It was fun performing with you lot. Unfortunately, the show was stopped before we could reach the grand finale. I do hope that we can all collaborate on another project together. But for now I must bid you adieu, and with those words, Mr. Compress left the stage. After a brief period of silence, everyone's focus shifted to Twice. Can't I just stay here and do nothing? I would love to help out in any way that I can. So it's decided. Twice you're with us. In Izuku's opinion, this development could not have transpired more perfectly. Although Tamura will undoubtedly return, his threat level is at best minimal at this time. It was a shame that he had brought Mr. Compress along, but he was not nearly as resourceful as Izuku thought he was. But now he could proceed to the next stage of his scheme. Toga said, "So bad boy, where should we go next?" "Didn't you hear Kurogiri? This is our new headquarters," Izuku responded. He walked over to the bar and took a seat on one of the stools. While Dabi leaned against the bar and Kurogiri started to sweep in the background for maintenance, the others followed his example and sat down close to him. "Now," Izuku said, turning his bar stool to face the other members of the group. Izuku's face darkened as he recalled the time he was left bleeding out alone, without a police officer or pro-hero in sight. "I am not your leader, consider me an advisor. If my life becomes endangered, then that would be insignificant in the grand scheme. What we represent must never die, that would be the greatest travesty of all. Because the system is broken, heroes will never notice injustices occurring in their own backyards, but we will remind them that there is no rest for the wicked. Heroes must always be reminded of the shadows that lurk behind every alley and between every crease and crevice. Essentially, that is the concept of evil. This is an ideology that must endure forever. Our objective is not to preserve any specific member, but to preserve the concept." Mr. Compress and Tamura went into an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was sentimental despite being shabby and gritty. It was, after all, the same building that All for One had utilized for recuperation. A number of medical devices were strewn along the side of his chair, which was positioned in the center and looked like a throne. This would be the League of Villains' new headquarters. Instead of dying, the League would resurrect with greater strength than before. It felt like a hand-in-glove fit when Tamura took the seat that All for One had occupied before. He saw dozens of obedient soldiers, subjects, and followers waiting for him to give the order. His soldiers would be armed and prepared to fight against all pro-heroes and their backers, with those who demonstrated their loyalty at the front. "The chair suits you," Mr. Compress said and gave him a compliment. He looked around, assessing the room and their surroundings. "Why, we could turn this into a throne room," he said. Since they were already in agreement, Tamura didn't reply. The two of them seemed to click in a way that he honestly had not expected. He did, however, feel the same way about Twice and Kurogiri. He wondered about it. Tamura said, "Compress," and started talking. "Tell me the truth. Why did you choose to follow me?" Mr. Compress turned to look at him again. Although his mask made it impossible to read his face, Tamura could tell that he was trying to find the right words to say rather than expressing his opinions. "Speak freely," prodded Tamura. "Well," began Mr. Compress. "I went with my gut, and my gut told me to follow you. My instincts have served me well so far, so why stop now?" Tamura gave him a narrowed look. The pressure from his menacing glare would have made most people give way. Tamura repeated, "I thought I told you to speak freely. That boy, something is off about him. He is dangerous, yet not in the conventional manner. He is a danger to all whom he comes in contact with. Tamura was silent but still lost in thought. To put it simply, Compress went on to say, he is not just the enemy of pro-heroes, or the enemy of villains, but he is the enemy of all of mankind. Tamura laughed. It was said that a boy without a quirk posed the biggest threat to humanity. What a farce. Maybe that's what made him so dangerous, though. In the same way that people ignored his personal suffering and expected a pro-hero to take care of him, pro-heroes essentially ignored minor infractions. Maybe he and Izuku had similar upbringings. Pro-heroes and society at large failed them both during their time of need. But there was a clear distinction between the two. In addition to the fact that Izuku's misfortunes were caused by All for One's schemes, the boy used his ordeal as justification to terrorize everyone. He lacked a moral compass, and it was only a question of time until he betrayed his own supporters to further his own goals, whatever they might be. And his weakness was there. He is insane, declared Tamura. He used to talk in a patronizing manner when he called him crazy. But now he felt sorry for him. Yet, his insanity seeks solace. That's why he allows Toga to cling to him. Mr. Compress gave an understanding nod. He was able to put the pieces together on his own by adhering to Tamura's reasoning. Deep down, he is afraid of telling a joke, and being the only person in the room who laughs. A sly grin appeared on Tamura's face. Precisely. We shall build our forces and allow him to weaken the pro-heroes for us. Then, we will attack him when he least suspects it. And when his back is against the wall, he will reveal his true colors to his followers. By then it will be too late for them all. Katsuki was stunned. The fact that Deku no and Izuku had survived this whole period astounded him. He was mistaken to believe that he had passed away. But in the blink of an eye, he was suddenly taken from him. Furthermore, he was powerless to change it. In addition to his resourcefulness and cunning in battle, he was frequently commended for the strength of his quirk. However, despite his increased strength, he had still failed to save a friend in his hour of greatest need. It was the same as when that slime villain made him his prisoner. He was far too weak to save himself, despite the professional heroes at the scene praising him and his quirk. He was told throughout his life that he was unique and that he was meant for great things, and at one point, this boosted his ego. What, then, was causing his weakness? The fiery young man hardly paid attention as his teacher, Shota, explained that he had to go to a meeting to make decisions about Yue's future, and would thus grant the class the day's recess. All he wanted was to be allowed some time to reflect. On multiple occasions, Eijiro tried to engage him in conversation, but Katsuki could only give him clumsy acknowledgement responses. Before Katsuki, Eijiro said, "Hey, are you listening to me?" It seemed as though the spiky-haired blonde had been daydreaming the entire time the two close friends were walking off campus in the direction of their respective homes. Katsuki remarked, "What is it? You're noisy," he retorted, "and you're not paying attention, Eijiro." There was a brief pause, and Eijiro's expression shifted to one of concern, and he sighed. Eijiro didn't want to say it because it was a delicate topic, but he didn't need to finish his statement to make his point. "You've barely said 2 words to anyone all day. Even after Shota said that the meeting he was going to attend could end with Yue shutting down, you didn't even bat an eyelash. Is this about?" With his dagger-like gaze, Katsuki challenged Eijiro to complete his thought. However, as swiftly as his face had evolved, it returned to its more somber expression. He kept playing the scene over and over in his mind. He was making a valiant effort to save a friend he thought was dead. He could see the horror and surprise in Izuku's eyes, but he was powerless to stop it. Katsuki could only watch Izuku disappear because he couldn't use his quirk and run the risk of hurting him. The pit of his stomach curled with a sickening sensation. "Hey, Eijiro," Katsuki said, his face heavy with sadness. "What good is a quirk that can't save a friend?" Eijiro yelled at him, "Don't blame yourself. Don't do that to yourself. That's not fair, no one expects you to save everyone." Then Katsuki retorted, "He's not just anyone." His face was contorted in a mass of anger and self-loathing, and his teeth were clenched. In addition to having to admit his weakness in saving a very close friend in his hour of need, he was also in pain from having to face the fact that he had failed to save him. To put it mildly, it was an extremely difficult pill to swallow. Katsuki looked at his hands in disgust, then clenched his fists as his frustration grew. "Right now he's probably being tortured by the same villains that came after me, and there's nothing I can do about it," he exclaimed. "I failed when it mattered the most, and now I have to atone for it." Eijiro called out his name and asked where Katsuki was going as he passed him, but Katsuki just told him to go home and that he would call him the next day. The blonde with the spiky hair headed to the hospital and went into the intensive care unit, where a nurse welcomed him with a cheerful smile. She questioned him, back again. After giving a nod, Katsuki signed the visitor's logbook. He was then led to the patient room by the nurse. Mrs. Midoriya has been doing well and is on the road to recovery. She seems to respond well to people talking to her, said the nurse. As he entered the patient room and sat down close to the bed, Katsuki merely nodded to her. The nurse said, "Come get me if you need anything," and shut the door herself. Katsuki felt bad because he had not sent her a get-well card or a letter since he had last done so. If I could have saved Izuku, then he would be here to give you all of the love and support that you need, Katsuki was thinking. Leaning forward in his chair and putting his hands together, he inhaled deeply as he readied himself to say the most difficult thing he had ever had to say in his life. "I'm sorry," explained Katsuki. All it took was that his eyes began to well up with tears. Katsuki worked hard to wipe away the tears as they continued to fall. "I'm so sorry. I'm sorry that I couldn't save your son. I'm sorry for being too weak. The flood arrived as though a dam had been breached. He had to take a few moments to gather himself. Look at him, becoming a whiner. How would Izuku now perceive him? If he told him that he had changed, would he even believe him? He was definitely not the same person he had been before, though perhaps not entirely. "I swear," Katsuki said, "I'll bring him back." The same nurse who had escorted Katsuki to the room suddenly knocked on the door and came in carrying a letter enclosed in an envelope. Saying, "I have a letter for Mrs. Midoriya," she gave it to Katsuki. "You should read it to her whenever you get the chance. I'm sure that she'll appreciate it." After that, the nurse left the room and shut the door behind her once more. After wiping his eyes, Katsuki noticed that the envelope had been sent from the US. He didn't know that Izuku's mother had contacts outside of Japan, so he found it odd. His face darkened as he opened the envelope and quickly read the letter, and his fist clenched so tightly that, because of his quirk, he nearly burned the paper to a crisp. "How dare you?" Katsuki spit out a bitter spit. Why did he decide to write her a letter at last? Katsuki half considered burning the letter to a crisp, but he knew that would not be fair. "You useless old man," he said. Instead, trying to suppress his disdain, he read the letter out loud to Inko. To Inko, "I believe someone is targeting me, and I fear that you may read this letter when it is far too late for me. I pray that this letter isn't intercepted. I apologize for not being able to provide you with the support you need in recent months. My bank account was hacked, and my funds were frozen. I was unable to call or contact you by cell phone because my service shut off because I couldn't pay, and I had to lounge in my boss's house until I was finally able to get back on track. I'll be home shortly. I will always love you. Hisashi Midoriya." Katsuki had a shocked expression on his face. He had doubted Izuku's father just moments before and dismissed him as a deadbeat because he was never present, but it appeared that his incapacity to go home must have been intentional. If so, this might indicate that Izuku's father's life is in jeopardy in addition to that of his mother. Their whole family had become a target for whatever reason. Who could he tell, though? His teacher? No, this was a serious situation. He needed to get in touch with the chief of police right away. Fortunately, following the stain incident, Officer Suragame provided him with his contact details. For a moment, Katsuki left the room and entered a hallway where neither patients nor staff were present. He tried to call the personal cell phone of Suragame, but he didn't answer. Rather, a voicemail greeted him. "I am at a meeting right now, please leave your message after the beep." "Beep," Katsuki asserted. "Call me back as soon as you can, it's an emergency." He clenched his jaw and put his phone back in his pocket, but as he turned to head back to Inko's room, a man in dark shades, a tan pair of baggy pants, and a black shirt with golden trim around the collar and sleeves interrupted him. His enormous red wings, which protruded from his back like a bird, were his most remarkable characteristic, though. Perhaps even better, like a hawk. "Come with me." Iwao received an urgent meeting invitation at an office in the center of Tokyo. Well, since he was partially responsible for the meeting's initial conception, maybe, invited, wasn't the best word to use. Following the events that occurred in the United Arab Emirates, in order to decide how to proceed with their investigation into the League and the future of UA, Chief of Police Kenji Suragame decided to call a meeting at training grounds where the League of Villains was trying to kidnap a promising pro-hero prospect. Overall, however, Iwao was more excited to share the information he had acquired with the other members of the group in order to help put a definitive end to the League of Villains. It was difficult for him to remain calm when he reflected on the passing of Mikoto and his two partners, Koichi and Kazuho. He would not be able to live with himself unless he brought their killer, or killers, to justice. The participants rented an office at the bottom floor of a corporate bank headquarters. Awao asked the receptionist about a mandatory meeting on the first floor after he had entered, and she pointed him in the direction of a hallway to his right. He found the meeting room and went inside after moving down the hallway. The meeting room was a tiny, square office space with a table in the middle and a whiteboard on the wall behind it. Each participant had access to one of the 6 chairs, but 2 were absent. Awao, Shota Aizawa, the pro-hero eraser head, the UA principal, Nezu, a dog-like creature that was able to display a quirk of extraordinary intelligence, and Chief Kenji were present thus far. After a moment of eye contact, Awao rubbed the back of his head and remarked, "I didn't know that this was a casual meeting." Awao himself was dressed considerably more formally than the others. Shota wore just a basic black t-shirt, jeans, and sneakers, while he wore a black button-up shirt, slacks, and dress shoes. Shota dismissed Awao with a sneer and looked away. 3 of the chairs at the far end of the table were empty when Awao sat down. Awao questioned, "Who are we missing?" "Hawks will be here soon. He said that he had some valuable information to relay," Kenji said. And All Might said that he would be running a bit late. A slim man with unkempt golden hair interrupted Kenji as he entered the meeting room. It was clear from his tattered suit and gaunt eyes that he didn't get much sleep. Nevertheless, it was pretty amazing that All Might was able to make it despite his injuries from the match against All for One. "I apologize for my tardiness," he said, his face a godly expression. He looked weak and frail, a far cry from his heyday. Despite his physical ailments, he was determined to continue moving forward. That's what made a hero, really. He sat down close to the middle of the table, on the left, closest to the door. The other attendants showed their respect for him by nodding toward him. Kenji suggested, gesturing to Nezu and Shota, "I do think in the absence of Hawks that we can move to discuss the fate of UA High School first." Prior to speaking, Principal Nezu paused to clear his throat. "Yes, well, I proposed to turn UA into a dormitory, where the students would be able to live on campus and be under surveillance 24/7. Kenji hummed as he considered the implications of Nezu's scheme. That would require permission from the parents. How can we ensure that their children will remain safe? They're not pro-heroes yet, they shouldn't be exposed to villains. Unfortunately, we may have already compromised their safety enough, don't you think?" The words, "I will take full responsibility for my class," were spoken by Shota. "I am willing to resign due to my failures to protect them in light of this new threat that we face." The pause was pregnant. The school would suffer a great loss if Shota were to leave as an instructor. He was a tough but fair teacher and a very competent pro-hero. Some of the staff and faculty held him in high regard, and he was respected by all of the students. All Might coughed out, "I do not think that will be necessary," before continuing. He was suffering from the effects of his battle with All for One once more. However, this time, All Might forced a feeble smile at him, but it was still as bright as ever. "Thanks to the UA security force, the Tokyo Police Department, and the courageous men and women who put their lives in danger to protect UA, we managed to avert a potential catastrophe." "You too as well, Shota," All Might said. Shota looked him in the eye and gave a feeble nod. He was very disappointed in himself for not being able to protect his students. In what way could they gain the trust of the guardians and parents? But how can we ensure their safety? The argument being made is that students should never have to fend for their life. After all, they're just kids. "It's our job to shield them," replied Shota. "There will be parents who will wish to pull their children out of UA, and that is understandable. That is why after this meeting I shall take the time to go door to door and speak with each and every single one of their parents and assure them that we will be able to keep their children safe. However, the decision to withdraw them from UA, or allow them admission, will ultimately fall on the parents," said All Might. Shota said, "You read my mind," and started talking. He turned to look at Principal Nezu and said, "I'll be with you when you talk to their parents. And I will save my resignation for another rainy day." Principal Nezu had to give him a quick smile. Kenji gave an understanding nod. Kenji told them, "In the end, we are here to create solutions, not to cast blame. Thank you All Might, for your continued support in regards to UA's well-being. On our end, the Tokyo Police Force shall investigate the League of Villains and serve justice to them." After saying that, Awao got up and walked over to the head of the table. He set a manila folder on the table and unfolded it to show a number of pictures. So that his colleagues could look at the private crime scene photos, he laid them out on the table. Awao spoke despite their horrifying looks, which spoke for themselves. He indicated a severed female head floating on a toilet and said, "These are the bodies of my partners, and the one you see here. She was Detective Sukachi's sister and a mutual friend of mine. Makoto Tsukachi. Everyone's expression was solemn. This body here, Iwao paused to gather his thoughts before continuing. He gestured toward a woman's burned remains. Her flesh was dark like meat that had been exposed to the flames because her body had been burned so severely. This was the body of. The tension was broken by a knock on the door. Iwao let out a breath when the door opened and Hawks and an unannounced visitor entered together. "Excuse me, but I have brought a special guest with me," Hawks replied. Because he was never given the opportunity to fully comprehend what he was being pulled into, Katsuki seemed quite anxious. He didn't know how, but Hawks told him that his relationship with Midoriya would play a part in this. Both Shota and All Might smiled sincerely at his pupil. Their smile was reflected in Nezu's. Kenji acknowledged the blonde boy with a nod, and Iwao waited for the newcomers to settle in before moving on. His words, as I was saying, went on. Now that the brief respite had allowed him to gather his thoughts, his tone was much more level. This is the body of Queen Hashisuka, otherwise known by her alias as Queen Bee. She was a crime lord that peddled a drug known as Trigger in the Naruhata ward, Iwao said. However, Iwao said, losing control of his feelings, he almost pulled blood from his clenched fist. Her true name was Tamao Oguro. Except for Katsuki, who didn't fully grasp the connection, everyone's eyes widened in surprise. Shota exclaimed, "Oguro, then that means," shockingly. "She was your." All Might was unable to complete the sentence. "Yes," Iwao said. "She was my daughter." As Iwao's words weighed heavily on the group, silence fell throughout the room. Katsuki was also overcome with a sense of gloom. Had his daughter died? Who would act in that way? And why? After setting a manila folder on the table, Iwao opened it to show multiple images of a person Katsuki was all too familiar with. As Katsuki whispered, "These," said Iwao, "are all of the confirmed sightings of Izuku Midoriya in the Naruhata ward." The eyes of All Might widened. Young Midoriya? But I thought that he was dead? Katsuki exclaimed, "He's not dead," quickly. Everybody in the room gave him a questioning look. "I saw him with my own two eyes. He was there during the fight when All Might busted up All for One. He looked scared. He said my name and before I could even get to him he was warped away. He slipped right through my fingers." Hawks added, "I can confirm this as well, to this. I saw what had happened while I was circling the scene in the air." Interesting, was the only thing Kenji could say. "So no one knows where he is now, correct?" "He's probably been taken by the League of Villains once more. In that case, we need to save him," All Might exclaimed, his fists clenched. He secretly held himself accountable for Midoriya. Midoriya rejected his attempt to give him his quirk, All for One. He ought to have persisted more, though. Checked on him more, maybe, anything. "Are we sure that he's being held against his will?" asked Kenji. The room became tense just from that question. Nezu said, "What do you mean, Kenji?" Kenji got up from his chair and walked over to the whiteboard, saying, "Well, let's go over the timeline of events, shall we?" He wrote the number 1 on the board using a black marker that he had taken from his pocket. First, according to a police report, Izuku Midoriya was arrested by Detective Tsukachi for participating in a drug deal, specifically Trigger, Kenji wrote on the board. Deal in drugs? Katsuki couldn't understand. That sounded nothing like the Deku he was familiar with. He wasn't a criminal, but he was a wimp, yes. There was no sense in it. "Pardon me, but I don't think this is real," All Might said. "I cannot imagine young Midoriya participating in a drug deal. What would be his motive? He wanted to join the police academy. Why would he jeopardize that?" "We've all done crazy things when we were desperate and young," Iwao responded. "Not that crazy," added Shota. "Skipping school is one thing, but this is something else entirely." In a whisper, Katsuki said, "Money." Kenji asked, "What was that Bakugo?" "Money. I saw a letter that his dad wrote to his mom at the hospital. He doesn't live at home with them since he works overseas. He claimed that his funds were frozen somehow, and he felt targeted. I was going to call you and tell you this before I was taken here. So if he was desperate for money, then that would explain why he felt like he had no choice but to do it," Nezu continued. "But it's strange how his father would be targeted overseas. Is it a coincidence? Or is it connected to the League?" Everyone thought for a second, but Kenji didn't need much time to think before moving on. After writing the number on the board, he said, "That brings me to number 2. Izuku Midoriya is spared by the League of Villains after they burned down and killed Detective Tsukachi. According to what Midoriya told me during my interrogation of him, He said that he managed to convince the villains that he could help them since he had a notebook filled with the quirks of all the pro heroes. All Might turned to look at Katsuki, who turned to look at him and the others. Katsuki confirmed this information by nodding his head. Yay, I've seen him write in it a few times. But he didn't just have their quirks too, he had their weaknesses written in as well. So you're saying that the League might have conspired to freeze his father's funds to make him desperate for money? Nezu responded. That certainly is a possibility, Kenji said. Iwao questioned, but why would they need him? They could have just taken his notebook, they didn't have to capture him unless he willingly offered his services to them. Everyone looked at Iwao's statement. Katsuki was taken aback, Shota was taken aback, Nezu was shocked but intrigued by Iwao's claim. Kenji appeared unconcerned as though he agreed with him, Hawks' expression was neutral, and All Might gazed at Iwao with daggers. What are you implying, Iwao? All Might spoke sharply to him. He wasn't saying that, surely. I will allow Iwao to further explain himself because this takes us to number 3, Kenji continued. Izuku Midoriya has a confirmed sighting in the Naruhata ward. He was dropped off at an apartment by Koichi Himawari, also known as the Crawler, a vigilante. He was dropped off at the same apartment that Tamao Oguro's remains were found in. Iwao elaborated on what Kenji had said, writing a brief account of events on the board. And it was during this time that Koichi came to me and Popstep to relay information that Midoriya said to him, Iwao said. Koichi claimed that Midoriya had told him that he was used to peddle trigger for money, and that he hadn't known what he was delivering at first. After he had found out the truth, he ran away from the League. Would the League really go as far as to sabotage a teenager's life just to use him to peddle trigger? Nezu inquired. No, Iwao replied. He was asked by All Might, what makes you so sure? Because according to Koichi, Makoto Tsukachi showed up to his apartment while he was there with Midoriya. He said that Makoto used her quirk to catch him in a lie, Iwao replied. Every Might questioned, what did he lie about? He lied about his involvement, or lack thereof, in Detective Tsukachi's death. Still, added Kenji. Him lying about it could have been for a number of reasons. Perhaps to protect you and the vigilantes from the League. That's a possibility, Iwao said in agreement. But ever since his arrival, very strange things had happened. Kuen's modus operandi completely changed. Before, her schemes had been very direct. However, the nature of both Makoto and Koichi's deaths, as well as Popstep dying to a bomb because it was placed in a location where only she could get to due to her quirk that had been tied to a code to disarm. Iwao's words lingered in the air after a brief pause. I couldn't help but think that someone was the mastermind behind all of this. And Midoriya was spotted being dropped off at Kuen's apartment. Surely you don't mean that, All Might shuddered at the thought, his eyes widening. Yes. Izuku Midoriya masterminded all of their deaths. All Might started to say, that can't be. Katsuki yelled, that's bull, and got up from his chair. He made every effort to avoid slamming his fist into the table. He glared at Iwao, who gave him a resolute look in return. You can't just go around accusing people of shit. I saw him with my own 2 eyes. Deku was scared. He looked afraid, he said. Shota gazed at him and said, Bakugo, he had a leer that could have split a diamond in 2. Control yourself. Remember where you are. Calm yourself, young Bakugo, All Might tried to reassure him over. Kenji also added, I know that this might be hard for you to hear, Bakugo, however, with the facts being that they are, we can only assume that Midoriya had been forced to aid the League in murdering them under the threat of his family, possibly due to his interest and knowledge of several different quirks and their weaknesses. With a grimace, Bakugo returned to his chair. Was that true, damn it? Can't it be true? Deku? Really? He? A criminal? He was unable to comprehend it. And on top of that, the Deku he knew would sooner die than commit murder. Hawks shot back, actually Kenji, I disagree, everybody looked at him. Hawks had been comparatively quiet until now. I wasn't sure before what to make of it based on what I saw, but now I have no doubt in my mind that Izuku Midoriya is a willing member of the League of Villains. There was silence in the air because of the shock on everyone's faces. Kenji broke it at last. What do you mean? What did you see? Think about it. The League of Villains are in possession of a quirk that allows them to warp their members at will. However, there were a few villains that were left behind. Even All For One himself was left behind. If Midoriya was simply a pawn that had outlived his usefulness, why would they choose to warp him too? Hawks posed to everyone. There was a brief pause during which everyone collected their thoughts. Maybe because he knew too much for them to let him go? Nezu inquired. I hate to be harsh, a WoW started, but the League doesn't capture people indefinitely who know too much. They kill them. So if Midoriya was in possession of knowledge that they could endanger them, and they had no further use for him, then why didn't they kill him? All Might questioned, how do we know that the League of Villains were done with him? We don't, said Hawks. But that was twice now that he managed to escape from them. Either the League is sloppy, or someone is playing us. Nezu turned to Kenji and asked, has he ever contacted the police for help? Kenji wrote, yes, this brings me to my fourth point, on the board. Izuku Midoriya escapes from the League and comes to me with information about their plan to capture and recruit Katsuki Bakugo. Well, you did mention earlier that you interrogated him. I was wondering where that fit on the timeline, Nezu replied. But this means that Hawks' theory has a hole in it then, Shota guessed. Why would Midoriya betray the League if he's working for them willingly? Maybe his true goal is to destroy them from the inside, Nezu said. Although that makes sense, that still wouldn't absolve him of his crimes. At best he would be charged with conspiracy to commit murder. Does that sound like something your former classmate would do even under these circumstances? Katsuki responded to Kenji. Katsuki gave a headshake. And no, he'd rather die than do that. All Might turned to face Iwao and said, people act differently when they're desperate and young, describing Midoriya's behavior in his own words. Or, Hawks said again. We are assuming the best and not the worst. Midoriya isn't betraying the League because he wants to take it down for the sake of justice. He's betraying the League because he is conspiring to take it over. Hawks jolted the room to silence once more. That is a theory that I have suspected yet could not allow myself to reconcile, Iwao stated. I don't think anyone, let alone a child, would be capable of what happened to everyone in Naruhata. All Might pressed, but, we don't know for sure, right? We're just speculating. Either theory could be true but we don't know yet. Precisely, replied Kenji. We do not know for sure. However, as I said before, we have evidence, albeit circumstantial, that places him at one crime scene. The scene being Tamao Oguro's burned apartment where her body was found inside and burned as well. And that is precisely why I plan to hold a news press conference and officially name Izuku Midoriya as a person of interest in the death of Tamao Oguro. Katsuki scowled. He knew he couldn't protest, but he wanted to. How could he respond? Deku himself was the only one who could respond to these urgent inquiries, and he wasn't present. Thus, Kenji's objective was to. So you plan on naming him a person of interest so that he would come forward and cooperate with the police department? Perhaps for a plea deal and a lighter sentence? Nezu wanted to clarify things. Considering the circumstances, I would be willing to grant him immunity if he was willing to step forward and aid us in bringing down the League of Villains, Kenji stated. Shota asked, are you okay with this? To Iwao. It would not feel fair to anyone, much less Iwao, for someone who he believed plotted to kill his daughter, his friend, and other vigilantes to be given immunity for his crimes. I am, Iwao started, because I don't think he will come forward. Why is that? Inquired Shota. Because he believes in my theory, I presume, Hawks replied. He believes that Midoriya isn't interested in bringing down the League of Villains because he is a part of the League now. But what if he isn't able to come forward because the League has him held hostage? Replied All Might. The League just suffered a big blow and they're perhaps wounded now more than ever. If he managed to escape their grasp before, he should be able to now, Iwao said. We will give him however long he needs to attempt to contact us, however, if no attempt is made at all then. All Might remarked, then Hawk's theory would be right. But the only way to know for sure would be to speak with him ourselves. So the priority of the police department is simple, to find Izuku Midoriya. Day 1 of the crisis, 12:30 p.m. Following the meeting, attendees started to file out and talk about their next agenda items. With a worried look on his face, All Might dragged Bakugo aside. All Might said to him, are you okay, young Bakugo? Bakugo's distress was not concealed. His face was covered with it. His clenched fists were white-hot with anger, and his crimson irises glistened with hatred. Bakugo spat, there's no way that I'm okay right now, instead. All Might scowled and looked defeated. He wanted to say anything, anything at all, to cheer up the young man. Words could not express Bakugo's feelings when he learned that someone he had known as a friend as a child would suddenly become interested in the death of a teenage girl. But before All Might could say anything more, his phone rang and he saw that he had a crucial appointment when he looked at the screen. I'm sorry, young Bakugo, but I have to go, All Might said, putting his hand on Bakugo's shoulder. Hawks. All Might waved to Hawks, who had been chatting with Suragame and Knuckle Duster. Hawks strode toward All Might, expressionless. Please take care of young Bakugo for me. I have another urgent meeting to attend to. Hawks squinted at All Might for a moment. He seemed to want to say something, but he decided to keep his thoughts to himself instead. Hawks put his hands on both of Bakugo's shoulders and said, "All right, you can leave him to me." The boy initially seemed to be quite irritated by the gesture, but Bakugo knew something was wrong when he felt Hawks's hold tighten around his collarbone. He looked into Hawks's eyes and saw that the pro-hero had brimstone and fire brimming in them. Time: 1:45 p.m. Location: not specified. Kurogiri stood behind the bar, still wiping a few glasses with a white cloth, while Dabi sat at the bar and asked, "Tonight is the night, huh?" Kurogiri confirmed, "It would appear so," without raising his gaze. Kurogiri leaned his head against his hand and Dabi asked, "Do you think that his plan will work?" While he was speaking, Kurogiri started to clean the bar. It seemed well thought out, especially with the extra help that he enlisted from Naruhata. Dabi nodded enlightenedly, as though he had forgotten. "Right," he said. "That guy from the villain factory. He was the one that tracked us down because of Deku, right?" Kurogiri explained. "He tracked him down because Deku disposed of Queen Bee and the Naruhata vigilantes, while he was still cleaning. He's a powerful ally to have on our side." Dabi said, right, with boredom. He turned to face the television and said, "And he lied about his plan to kidnap the chief of police too. What a cheeky guy." Wall-mounted monitor. "Hey, turn the television onto the news station. We might as well have a front row seat to the show." Kurogiri took the remote control from the bar after giving a nod. He switched the channel to the news station after turning on the TV, and they noticed an intriguing headline. At 3:30 p.m., the Tokyo Police Department will make a public service announcement. Dabi remarked, "I wonder what it could be about." The time is 3:30 p.m. Location: headquarters of the Tokyo Police Department. Rather than being delivered to UA instead of being taken to the Tokyo Police Department headquarters, as Bakugo had assumed Hawks would do, he was shown around the building by a variety of news anchors, reporters, bloggers, citizens, and others. Bakugo questioned, "What's going on here?" From where he was in the air, being carried by Hawks, it appeared to be complete chaos. Hawks remarked, "You deserve to know the truth." With a flash of Hawks's pro-hero license, they landed on the ground in front of the building and went through the security checkpoint. They went inside and met Kenji Suragame, who was still assembling the podium. Bakugo couldn't help but grimace when he saw the photo of Izuku Midoriya on the side of the podium. Hawks said to Kenji, "Yo," and Kenji turned to look at Hawks with a gentle acknowledgement smile. "Hello Hawks. Are you here for me, or on behalf of the commission?" Kenji replied. The question made Hawks smile. He gestured to Bakugo, who appeared disoriented, and said, "No, for once I am here to do something of my own accord." Kenji glanced over at the boy, and his face darkened slightly. The dog questioned, "Is it wise for him to find out like this? Was it wise for Owa to be kept in the loop? If he steps out of line, the commission will." Kenji gave a firm response, "I have faith in Knuckle Duster, as should you. I know that if I were in his position after what we've just found out earlier this morning, I'd be out for blood." Hawks grumbled. Hey, exclaimed Bakugo. He was confused and lost on the topic at hand, and he was irritated that they continued talking as though he wasn't standing directly next to them. "What's going on? What are you two talking about? Stop talking as if I'm not here. You will soon understand why I brought you here, and why you must prepare yourself to do whatever is necessary, as a true hero should," Hawks said, placing his hand on Bakugo's shoulder. Hawks's cryptic statement surprised Bakugo, but he had no time to think it through because Kenji came up to the podium to look around at everyone who had gathered at headquarters. While Kenji Suragame adjusted the microphone on the podium, photographers snapped pictures and the audience fell silent. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I have gathered everyone here today to speak transparently on the wave of crime that has swept through not only Tokyo, but also the Naruhata district." A photo of Naomasa Tsukachi was put on the stand by one of his police aides. "This is Naomasa Tsukachi, a Tokyo police detective who perished in a fire that burned down the entire police building along with a half-dozen others. We have reason to believe that a criminal element known as the League of Villains were responsible for the heinous crime. The same League of Villains that had a failed kidnapping attempt on a pro-hero candidate, Katsuki Bakugo, as well as a failed attack on the UA Hero Training Course campus." To give his assistant time to switch the image to one of a teenage girl with short peach hair and an eye patch over her left eye, Kenji paused. "This is Kuen Hashisuka. She was a crime boss with a base of operations in the Naruhata district. She began to work closely with the League of Villains in order to peddle a drug known as Trigger to the streets of Tokyo, however. But the girl seemed to have a cheerful smile that could light up a room, and his assistant removed the photo and replaced it with another of the same girl. Her real name was Tamao Oguro. She had been possessed by a quirk that took the form of a bee that embedded itself inside of her brain. According to her autopsy report, her cause of death was strangulation, and a toxic amount of horse tranquilizer was found in her system as well. 3 images of Makoto Tsukauchi, Koichi Himawari, and Kazuho Hanayama were arranged side by side on a placard that the assistant put on the stand. These 3 victims were found in the Naruhata district during the same time as Tamao Oguro's death. According to the coroner, Makoto Tsukauchi had a toxic amount of horse tranquilizer in her system that rendered her immobilized before she was then decapitated. Koichi Himawari was also decapitated at the scene. Kazuho Hanayama was killed by a bomb, and we believe that she was directly targeted since the bomb was in a location where only she could reach with the use of her quirk. The audience became agitated as Kenji's voice faded. What was the purpose of all this information? The assistant substituted a photo of Izuku Midoriya for the one of the 3 dead victims. This young man is Izuku Midoriya. He was believed to have been killed in the same fire that claimed Naomasa Tsukaichui's life at the police station. But, he came to the police for help and claimed to have been kidnapped by the League of Villains. He tipped the police off on the League's plot to kidnap a UA student named Katsuki Bakugo. However, Kenji hesitated. An autopsy report on Tamao Oguro's death showed that she had been sexually assaulted prior to being drugged and asphyxiated. Semen analysis has been cross-matched with our databases, and we have found a match in none other than Izuku Midoriya. Bakugo was hearing things he could not believe. Sexual assault, Deku? Using drugs? Murder? Was this accurate? How? Why? This was not possible. There was no sense in it. He looked up at Hawks, who gave Bakugo a sad look in return. After Kenji's statement, the crowd erupted, screaming, shouting, and yelling for more information. Is this the best that the Tokyo Police Department could do? Blame a boy who can't be older than 15? Huh? Yelled one man at the chief of police. Kenji halted the crowd by raising his hand. The restless crowd eventually subsided after a few moments, allowing the chief of police to resume his remarks. That is not all, but the timing and circumstances of this event places Izuku Midoriya at Naruhata during the time of both Makoto and Koichi's deaths, as he was the one suspected to have used the horse tranquilizer to subdue both Tamao and Makoto. We also have reason to believe that he was the mastermind behind Kazuho's death as well. Kenji leaned in toward the microphone and put both hands on the podium. And that is why we are declaring Izuku Midoriya to be a primary suspect in the murders of Makoto Tsukauchi, Tamao Oguro, Koichi Himawari, and Kazuho Hanayama. All Bakugo could do was collapse to his knees in shock as the press flocked to ask their questions. Deku can't be it. Why? Why? Time, 4 p.m. Location: Tartarus, a special prison for villain criminals. Tartarus, a massive, all-encompassing fortress of reinforced steel and titanium protected by cutting-edge security measures created by Tokyo's brightest minds, was a unique prison that housed the most heinous criminals of the underworld. Every individual who tries to enter the prison is evaluated at the security checkpoint and their vehicle is inspected. The prison was situated on an island that is cut off from the outside world, and the only way to get in is via a long, winding drawbridge. This measure is applicable to everyone, not even All Might. All clear, said one of the cops. The guard signaled the opening of the bridge. Welcome to Tartarus, All Might. All Might drove past the checkpoint and up to the facility's front gate, known as the Bronze Gate, which was reputed to be nearly impenetrable. While waiting for the gate to open, All Might glanced to the side and noticed another car waiting as well. The driver of the all-black SUV was a young woman who, based on her attire, seemed to have worked at the prison. A young man in the passenger seat appeared to have been sleeping, as he had his hat brim over his eyes. The young lady turned to smile at All Might and gave him a joyful wave. Hey, everyone, we are your biggest admirers. Oh my goodness, she cried out, trying to rouse her passenger by repeatedly telling him that All Might was at his side, but he refused to move. All Might couldn't help but smile gently at them both. After all, the courageous men and women who toiled diligently at the prisons deserved a little respite, didn't they? Really, it's all right. All Might, let the young man rest. The woman nodded her head and grinned more broadly. All right, All Might, you're very thoughtful. As they say, you're very sweet. All Might rubbed his cheek in shame, realizing that he would never grow accustomed to the compliments he received. I'm grateful. Please keep up the good work, remember to take breaks, and most of all, remember to smile. All Might could see the young man's lips curl into a smile, but the woman nodded her head and smiled. He was awake then. At last, the gate opened, and two distinct cars came to accompany each of them. All Might was escorted to the visitor's entrance, while the young woman's car was taken to the employee entrance. All Might parked there, got out of his car, and had to go through a metal detector after being patted down. He was welcomed by the warden, who then led him to a downward-facing elevator. All Might, are you certain about this? He was asked by the warden. Yea, there is a lot that me and him have to discuss, All Might said, nodding his head. That guy gives me the creeps, the warden sighed. He seems to exude confidence even though he is imprisoned here below sea level. It almost seems like he's taking a little vacation, and I find that really annoying. All Might remained silent, and as the elevator door chimed open, a drop of perspiration trickled from his forehead. The two entered cell B10 after passing through a number of automated blast doors. It was a large, empty room with a nearly impenetrable glass wall, and the symbol of evil himself was on the other side of the glass. His name was muttered, All for One, by All Might. All for One remarked, what a pleasant surprise, All Might. All for One was strapped to a chair that pushed him to his feet, had an oxygen mask over his face to help him breathe, and was connected to a couple of IVs that continuously dripped fluids that probably kept him hydrated. The formerly formidable villain was restrained by a straitjacket reinforced with straps that attached to a metal panel on his chest, and his restraint could only be removed if someone knew the code. The warden said, be careful, I'll be monitoring this conversation in the control room next door, before leaving the room. The chair that was reserved for him was occupied by All Might. All Might, I'm here to ask you a few questions, All for One said. Please do that. Since the day I came here, I have had no one with whom to talk. The warden's voice came through the speakers set into the cell's walls. Remember All Might, you only have 15 minutes, she said. Ah, that is too bad, All for One smiled and said, you can ask me anything you want. I swear to be as truthful as I can when responding to your inquiries. Given everything you have done for me, this is the least I can do. Finished for you? All Might asked, his eyebrows lifted in interest. Is that a question you have? All for One inquired. It wasn't before, but it is now, said All Might. Well, if it was not for you and your feeble weakness, then I would not have been able to find my true successor, said All for One. That was one of my questions, All Might said, squinting his eyes. You claimed that you had a legitimate successor when I fought you. Who is it? Now, where is he? You know him all too well, All for One said with an even bigger smile. Perhaps you've already suspected him. But I wouldn't rule out you being in denial about his identity. It appears to be the demise of heroes. They constantly seek out the positive aspects of people, even when none are present. All Might clenched his teeth. This was classic All for One reasoning, and it was one of the reasons they were so completely at odds with each other. That is, they were on opposite ends of the spectrum and could never find common ground. I thought you said that you were going to answer my questions as honestly as possible, said the mighty. That's as honest as I can be without ruining the fun, All for One started, and you already know that one of my successors exists, don't you? As far as I know that you exist. All Might's eyes grew wide, and he looked for one, but the symbol of evil's smile never left his lips. How did you know? All for One kept grinning. You are aware of Tamura Shigaraki. So we're even, isn't that right? Maybe it was time for his successor to become the new symbol of peace. All Might grimaced. He didn't want his successor to be in danger, but those days seemed to be over, especially since All Might had to retire. Over the loudspeakers, the warden said, 10 more minutes. Izuku Midoriya, All Might said, leaning back in his chair. Do you recognize that name? Why did you take him hostage? With him, what did you want? And why did he get captured by the League of Villains once more? He smiled more broadly than he had ever done. My. There are many questions there. Which one would you most like me to respond to? Answer me this at least, All Might started. Did he actually have anything to do with Tamao Oguro's murder and the deaths of the Naruhata vigilantes? Before speaking, All for One gave his words considerable thought. He performed his part flawlessly. Your suspicion is that you think he was forced to work for us, right? What else am I supposed to believe? A good-hearted youngster, Midoriya aspired to be a pro-hero. According to what I've heard, he plans to enroll in the police academy and become a cadet in order to assist others. Why would he assist you in killing or hurting others? All Might inquired. I'll respond to the first of the two questions you posed. What else should you think? That is, All for One started to clarify. Some people keep their inner darkness hidden deep within themselves. A person can be shaped by tragic events and become withdrawn. When people learn to accept it, the dark becomes their friend, their ally, and their home. You can eventually start seeing if you live in the dark long enough for your eyes to get used to it. All for One's words surprised All Might. He found what he said to be logical. All for One put young Midoriya in a difficult situation with no way out, and the only things that could save him were All for One and the League of Villains, who became his home and support system. He had nothing else, so he didn't want anything else. However, that might change. I am aware of what you have done to manipulate young Midoriya. You should be ashamed of yourself, but we both know that you don't have the capacity to feel neither shame nor guilt for your actions, All Might said, his eyes resolute. I will prove to you that it's never too late to save someone, he said. Did I manipulate him, or did I allow him to show his true nature? Boom. All Might stumbled in his chair and fell to his knees on the floor as a shockwave rocked the prison's foundation. The former symbol of peace shouted at the speakers as the lights flickered on and off, and he desperately tried to get his bearings. What is going on? The warden's response was hysterical. I don't know. I think the prison has been hit with an EMP of some kind. It came straight from out of the sky. All Might gave All for One a threatening glare as he turned to face him. What have you done? All for One smirked half-heartedly. Are you blaming me? What could I have done from my cell? All Might gave him a severe look, then shifted his focus to the speakers. Warden. What's the status of the prison? What's going on? Tell me everything. The primary and secondary generators were temporarily offline on the main prison levels. All of the prisoners have escaped, thankfully. This level is below sea level, so we're running off of both electrical generators and hydropower, replied the warden. That's terrible. All Might let out a startled gasp. Are all those inmates free? Are we being targeted? How could someone drop an EMP from the sky? Replied All Might. The warden's response was frantic. I don't know. I just don't know. All I know is that right now the quirk-suppressing machine guns are also offline. It's madness up there. All Might was forced to clench his teeth. His knuckles bled from the force of his punches to the ground. All Might bemoaned his weakness more than ever before, saying, of all the times to be powerless. The warden shouted over the intercom, All Might. I'm sending down 2 of my most trusted security guards to help me escort you out of here. They will arrive shortly. All Might grimaced and rose to his full height. Why did he prioritize his life? Their primary goal should have been to apprehend the inmates and return them to their cells. It would be a waste of manpower to try to escort him. From behind the glass, All for One sarcastically remarked, even in an emergency such as this, the prison is choosing to waste what little resources it has left to escort you to safety. What a wonderful burden to bear, is it not, All Might? Since he had nothing to say, All Might remained silent. His thoughts had been read by All for One. 2 security guards rushed into the room as the blast doors suddenly opened. Oh, said the female security guard, it's you again, All Might. All Might took a moment to identify the woman's face. You're the same woman that I saw at the Bronze Gate earlier, right? She enthusiastically gave a nod. She pushed her friend in the arm with her elbow, and he sighed and kept his eyes down. Yep, it's me and my sleepy-head friend here at your service, she said. Everyone started laughing uncontrollably. All Might became uneasy as his voice reverberated through the speakers. What's so funny? The former symbol of peace asked, glancing at him. You never cease to amaze me. When All Might turned to face the security guard after being perplexed by All for One's statement, he noticed that her skin was melting off of her body like hot running wax. This unnerved him, and he stepped back from her. What's going on? Exclaimed All Might. Her smile was deranged. Wow, Mr. All for One. Nothing gets past you, she exclaimed. That is one of my young associates, Himiko Toga. Her quirk allows her to transform into the physical appearance of another person and even copy their voice. A most impressive quirk indeed. Though, unlike you All Might, I am well versed in her speech patterns, so I am not so easily fooled, explained All for One. Not so easily fooled? All Might privately muttered. Then All Might looked over at All for One. So, are you saying that you didn't have a hand in this? That is correct. The warden moved to stand next to Toga after passing through the blast doors, but when he took off his cap, his face started to change and twist in a sickening way. The warden's unassuming face changed to that of a rather attractive young man with jet black hair pulled back in a ponytail. The man's eyes were covered by a mask, and a scar extended past the bridge of his nose and down the middle of his face. The man said, All Might, it is an honor to meet you, grinning wickedly. You may not have heard of me, but I have heard lots of things about you. My name is number 6, and I am, or should I say, was, a member of the villain factory. All Might's eyes widened and a trickle of sweat trickled from his brow. 6th place? Who was he? He had never before heard of him. All for One said, "Ah, another one of my associates," and started talking. All Might gave him a quick look. When he was a boy he didn't have any memories of who he was or where he came from. I helped shape him into the villain that he is today, and gave him dominion over the villain factory, All for One told All Might. However, last I heard you were preoccupied with another project that I had assigned to you. I take it that you completed your task? Asked All for One. Number 6 glanced at the young security guard, who was still staring down, and then he looked back at All for One. Number 6 remarked, he was a tough man to find, and an even tougher man to fight. Oh, high praise coming from you, said All for One. The words, you, were interrupted by All Might. You're the one that's behind all of this? With a cackle, Number 6 gestured to the boy standing next to Toga. He sneered at him, saying, I was just obeying his orders, Mr. All Might, sir. What? The young boy took off his cap to show off his wild emerald green hair and glanced up at All Might. Toga combed through his hair to make it more even. It can't be, All for One couldn't contain their laughter. Like I said, you never cease to amaze me, Izuku Midoriya. Izuku, Midoriya, the boy gave them both a twisted smile and a murderous glare. That is no longer my name, Midoriya informed them at the same time. All for One, All Might, it is time that the two of you paid for your transgressions. When I'm done with you two, there will be nothing left. There won't be anything for anyone anymore. Hence my new name. I am None for All. Day 1 of the crisis. The time is 1:30 p.m. where? Not sure, a doubtful voice echoed in a dim hallway. Are you sure that the instructions given to you were correct? Tamura reassured his comrade. Yes, Mr. Compress, this is where Kurogiri wanted me to go. The previous day, Kurogiri had gone into Tamura's hiding place to talk to him. Evidently, All for One had left thorough instructions to guarantee Tamura's development. His assignment was to locate a physician at the Jaku General Hospital. But it wasn't just any doctor, it was the chairman. Kurogiri's instructions were carefully followed by Tamura and Mr. Compress. They went to the back of a hallway that was off limits to even hospital employees when they first arrived. There, Tamura pressed his fingers against a wall that appeared to be innocuous but then abruptly parted to reveal a dark hallway. After making their way through it, the two arrived at the end, which was sealed off by a second door that was equipped with several cameras and barred with reinforced steel. Tamura wasn't sure whether he should knock or speak, but as soon as the door chimed and the pressure was released, his question would be addressed. A bald and portly old man wearing a medical coat and professional clothes underneath it sat inside the door as it slowly opened. One distinguishing feature that complemented his overall style was his large rimmed spectacles. The elderly man's expression was indistinct as he turned in his chair to face Tamura. His face was illuminated by the dim purple light emanating from the test tubes that encircled the secret laboratory. Tamura was astounded by what he observed. Nomus of different sizes and shapes were suspended in liquid to preserve them inside the test tubes. This was the brains behind the nomus, then? The doctor said to him, welcome Tamura. It has been a long time. Tamura narrowed his eyes at the old man, and he sensed that Mr. Compress was looking at him. Mr. Compress inquired, have you met this man before? No, I have not, acknowledged Tamura. When the doctor said, it seems that your memories have not returned then. Recollections? More than usual, Tamura experienced an itch that made him want to scratch and claw at his body. Nevertheless, he winced as an unfathomable pain jolted through his mind. His mind was troubled by memories of meeting All for One and the doctor who was sitting in front of him when he was a child. But the images came and went like a phantom. The phenomenon appeared to have caught the attention of the doctor, and a sly smile crept up his face. Excellent. Tamura would be a better candidate for the experiment and eventually realize his full potential if he were released from the constraints of his past as soon as possible. The doctor stated, your memory shall resurface, in time. He got up from his chair and casually put his arms behind his back. Allow me to reintroduce myself to you. My name is Kyudai Garaki, chairman of Jaku General Hospital. I am a long-time acquaintance of All for One. One could even call us friends, the physician murmured. The idea of All for One having friends made Tamura blink. I am sure that you have been informed as to why All for One planned for us to meet, the physician responded. Tamura spoke quickly and bluntly, as if irritated that he had not been provided with the information. With impatience, Tamura said, just cut to the chase. The physician grinned. Very well, come with me. Kyudai guided the two to a test tube with dark panels obstructing the glass. Due to its background blend, it would be simple to overlook. In order to reveal a young man with long silver hair and a slim build suspended in the test tube's liquid, the doctor pressed a series of buttons on the panel attached to the tube. His mouth was covered with what looked like a breathing mask, and he was dressed in an abyssal bodysuit. That this man was the only human put in a test tube was not lost on Tamura. He was therefore unique, possibly even more unique than the nomus. This man's name is Nine, and he came to me due to the fact that his quirk caused him to suffer a terrible illness. You see, whenever he used his quirk, it would destroy him on a cellular level. Thus, he became weaker, frailer, and his body would surely fail him, explained the physician. The arms of Mr. Compress were folded across his chest. That doesn't sound like a very useful quirk then, he joked. Kyudai grinned. On the contrary, his quirk was perhaps the most powerful that I had ever seen. Nine possesses the ability to manipulate the weather itself. He can conjure storms, hurricanes, tornadoes. He could topple a city if he so wished. Both Mr. Compress and Tamura were in disbelief at what they had heard. His power was almost divine for a human being born with such a potent quirk. It was unfathomable to mortals. With genuine curiosity, Tamura questioned, "So, why are you showing us this? What use is someone whose own quirk kills him?" "Well, Tamura, you see, there was only one solution that I could come up with. I decided that the best way to heal him was to transfer a copy of All for One's quirk over to him." "What?" The doctor's words caused both Tamura and Mr. Compress to gasp. The doctor grinned so broadly at that his dazzling white teeth gleamed in the shadowy lab. "That's right, and it was a resounding success. Soon, he shall be ready to be unleashed onto the world. But not now, not yet," the physician murmured. "He hasn't stabilized just yet. But make no mistake, the transfer was a success." Tamura's face now bore a broad smile, and his eyes gleamed with evil delight. With a start, Tamura said, "So, that was All for One's plan then?" "Indeed. Now everything made sense. Deku, that little pipsqueak, could not have been the real heir to his sensei. Had he been, the boy would have been present to accept the honor of being bestowed with All for One's quirk in his place. He would instead continue to be quirkless and feeble. How appropriate it was for someone like him. He would soon be brought to heel, as would the rest of the world. "So, when do we begin?" Tamura inquired, clearly excited. He was impatient. As he walked up to another door close to the tube that Nine was in, the doctor started to say, "Originally, All for One wanted me to administer a test of sorts. Proof that you were ready for the mantle of All for One." To allow for the scanning of his eyes, he lifted his glasses. After a moment, the door chimed and he was able to get inside. Kyudai gestured for Tamura to follow him, and he did so. "But I was given special orders to prevent that test for you now," he said. He was closely followed by Mr. Compress. The great robber was a little nervous about what was about to happen. It sounded like a risky process that, if it went wrong, might have long-term repercussions. Tamura might even lose his life as a result. Why, then, hadn't his leader questioned that earlier? Mr. Compress sensed the ambition and resolve emanating from Tamura. He desired to establish himself as the spokesperson for the upcoming wave of evildoers. The monarch. The only one. Tamura may have thrown caution to the wind and accepted power at any cost as a result of Deku shattering the League of Villains. In any case, Mr. Compress believed it was his responsibility as his subordinate to help him at every turn. Automated bright white lights flickered on as the three of them entered the room, revealing a circular space with a chair in the middle that could fit a man strapped into. The chair was encircled by a number of immaculately clean wires and straps that suggested it had not been used in a long time. The doctor beckoned to Tamura, saying, "Please, lay down on the chair." Tamura didn't even think twice. Following instructions, he lay down on the chair. The doctor started strapping Tamura in and fastening wires to his body while Mr. Compress stood in the back with his arms folded across his chest. The doctor started to go over the technical details with Tamura while he worked. "There shall be 2 phases to this experiment. Phase 1 is the transfer of All for One to your body. It shall be introduced to you slowly to ensure that you remain stable and your body doesn't attack the new quirk factor. It shall be very painful," the physician stated with accuracy. Those words didn't even cause Tamura to blink. Anguish? He didn't care about that. "The second phase shall consist of stabilizing All for One, as well as reinforcing your body with variously different quirk factors in order to help accelerate the stabilization process." Tamura turned to the doctor and gave him a stern look as a result. "Do you think I have all the time in the world to spend in some tube like that other guy?" Tamura argued. The physician grinned. As I said, 9 is a special case. It has taken far longer for him to stabilize due to the amount of damage that his quirk has done to his own body. Repairing that has been very time-consuming. You, however, shall not go through such a lengthy process. In fact, if all goes well, it shall not take you long at all. Tamura's face relaxed and his tenseness eased. The news was good. He needed to exact his revenge on the world as soon as possible. Particularly with regard to Deku. He would reveal to him who the real heir was. Once all the necessary cables were connected, Kyudai led Mr. Compress to the control room so they could keep an eye on Tamura's development. After pressing a few buttons, the doctor's systems were all green and operational. Initiating transfer, buzzed a machine. There was the sound of machines whirring, and electricity suddenly flowed through the wires and in Tamura's direction. It sent a sickening tremor through his body, and his screams echoed off the walls of reinforced steel. Mr. Compress made a concerted effort to turn his head away. It was nearly impossible to watch his boss's suffering. But the doctor continued to grin menacingly. Everything was proceeding as planned. In the meantime, Tamura's mental state was shattered by the pain he experienced. His mind was filled with vivid details of the past. His home, his mother, father, sister, dog, etc. He possessed them all. And all of it was taken from him. Who was responsible? How did it happen? It was, well, HMPH. It fits, huh? And the bad guy who did it, he was the one. Time. 4:15 p.m. UA High School is where Eijiro Kirishima couldn't understand. Principal Nezu addressed the entire UA with a mass announcement at around 3:45 p.m. All faculty, staff, students, and teachers were instructed to gather outside on the PE grounds. Additionally, by the whole UA, the entire UA was genuinely meant by the principal. Every student was divided into classes and arranged in rows. Class A was in the front, closest to the podium where Principal Nezu and Shota Aizawa were standing to his immediate right. Class K was in the rear, followed by Class J, Class 1, and so on. They were accompanied by other employees, including the Chef Lunch Rush, Recovery Girl, Hound Dog, and Rescue Training Specialist 13, who was dressed like an astronaut. The rest of the staff, including Present Mike, Midnight, Snipe, Ectoplasm, Powerloader, Cementos, and Vlad King, were positioned to the side of the podium. But there was none of All Might. It was difficult for Eijiro to ignore the tense atmosphere. He sensed the nervousness and trepidation of everyone. Despite his best efforts, the redhead found it difficult to hide it. He wanted to stay as strong as a rock and set an example for his peers by putting on a brave front. Unshakable, unflappable, and immovable. However, Ochako Uraraka, a friend and confidant, comforted him with a soft and gentle whisper when a drop of perspiration fell from his brow. "I'm sure whatever it is, it will be fine," she said. Her smile and words were a stark contrast to her manner. With her hand near her chest, waves of apprehension rolled off her. Even though he wasn't entirely sure what she had said, Eijiro nodded his head in agreement. They could still hope for the best, so it was acceptable to feel uneasy. Eijiro whispered to Ochako, "By the way, have you seen Bakugo?" Ochako gave a headshake. She had concern in her eyes. "And no, I haven't seen him all day, and he hasn't answered my text messages either. I figured he'd be here by now." Eijiro tightened his jaw. That guy. Did he believe he was too cool to come or what? The redhead reasoned that since his friend was going through a lot, it would be best for him to give him some space. His long-lost friend, whom he thought had passed away, unexpectedly reappeared before being taken from him again. It made sense that Bakugo would have felt helpless and weak. It was a devastating blow to him that someone with his level of talent, who was constantly striving for victory, could not use his gifts to save a friend. Nevertheless, he wasn't a sucker for sulking. Perhaps he needed someone to support him, to be with him. But if he didn't let his friends assist him either, it would be difficult to do so. As news anchors positioned themselves right in front of the PE grounds, murmurs started to grow louder. It was a big one. The pit of his stomach was where he felt it. After what seemed like an eternity, Principal Nezu finally took the microphone, and all muttering fell silent. "Good afternoon, faculty, staff, and all students of UA. I am sure that you have all gathered here wondering why I have called this emergency meeting," Nezu started out by saying. In the crowd, he could almost feel heads nodding. They were not to blame. A lot had happened in a short period of time. He had the impression that he was always on the defensive, responding to recent occurrences rather than taking the initiative. Now was his opportunity to try to make things right. Not only for the present, but also for UA's future. For the sake of the heroes of tomorrow. In light of recent events, which included 2 attacks upon the campus of our esteemed school, we at UA place the safety of our students as our top concern. Which includes not only the students participating in the hero course, but all of our students who have enrolled in our ancillary programs as well. The students paused for a moment to consider the flurry of events that had taken place. Eijiro could imagine the adults' feelings. The campus had been the scene of too many attacks. Even with the hero killer stain incident, there were near misses, but Eijiro assumed that was just part of the deal. In any event, he eagerly anticipated Principal Nezu's next words. The whole school was waiting impatiently. With that in mind, we are suspending all on-campus programs outside of the hero course, effective immediately. Stunned quiet. A chorus of moans, grievances, frustration, surprise, and even tears followed. In the middle of the chaos, Eijiro could hear Mei Hatsume, a student in the support class, yelling. The redhead was incredulous. Every single one of those students whose aspirations were linked to UA, would they just be torn away from them like that? It was unfair. His fists clenched in disgust and rage. Was that it, then? Were they going to let the bad guys intimidate them into changing? Silence. Eraserhead's voice echoed so loudly over the audience that present Mike would have been pleased. His disgust and rage at the students' immature responses made him look down on them. He was aware of how much it would hurt them, he really was, but their lives and safety came first. He was mistaken in his hope that they would have been old enough to recognize that. After all, they were only children. As was to be expected, they were unable to see the wider picture. Shota took the podium with grace after Principal Nezu handed him the microphone. Do you think that this decision was an easy one for us to make? With this measure put in place, we have all but admitted our failure in protecting you. In my failure to keep my precious students safe. I even considered resigning from my role as a teacher. Everyone in the room was taken aback by this realization as the seriousness of Eraserhead's remarks dawned on them. The best that UA had was Eraserhead. Had to provide as a guardian as well as a teacher, and he had acknowledged that he had failed to keep his students safe. He must have felt a great deal of guilt, an incalculable amount. Then, it wasn't easy for him to do so in public. When I look at all of you, I see the future, the next generation of heroes. I know many of you are disappointed, hurt, and even afraid, but it is our responsibility to protect you, to do what's in your best interest at all times. It's what is expected of us as heroes, as adults and as guardians responsible for your well-being. We don't only owe it to you, but to your parents who entrusted us with your care. We can no longer place you all in harm's way, Shota said with a seriousness. What needed to be done was not negligible. However, those who remain in the hero course can only do so with expressed written consent by their parents. If your parents want to pull you out of the UA hero course program, then that is a decision that we will honor and respect. The PE grounds reverberated with the students' collective gasps and moans. Eijiro was stunned, and when he glanced at Ochako and the other students, he noticed how completely heartbroken they were as well. Everything happened too quickly, too abruptly, and too soon. Go home, speak to your families, and contact us when a decision has been made. A horde of reporters, journalists, and paparazzi surrounded the UA as Shota moved away from the microphone. Faculty members and surrounded them with inquiries. What if none of the students in the hero course can return? Are the employees going to resign and return to their heroic roles in order to take on the League of Villains? Does this ruling have anything to do with the Tartarus prison break? All of the heroes on the podium were taken aback by that question. A prison vacation. It is 4:30. Where? Jaku General Hospital. Katsuki Bakugo couldn't think of anything. Even though he was weak, scrawny, and quirkless, the kid with the chicken legs did everything in his power to prove that he could become a hero. Was the main suspect in multiple fatalities? What on earth was happening? He proceeded to the only location he was aware of. To visit Inko Midoriya at the hospital. He took a seat in the chair and looked at her sleeping face. She was much thinner now, her face was sunken in, her hair was longer than usual, haggard, and unkempt. Katsuki would have tried to keep her well groomed if he could, but he was not good at anything like that, and the best he could do for her was to be by her side, especially now. The TV was on the news channel, and a notice at the bottom of the screen said, "Please contact the Tokoyo Police Department right away if you have any information about Izuku Midoriya's whereabouts. The suspect is thought to have connections to the League of Villains and has been connected to 5 murders." Bakugo tightened his jaw. This isn't possible. They're wrong. I know they are, Bakugo started, his fists clenched, his red eyes looking at Inko, and his determination growing stronger. Yes, it must have been an error. Deku was many things, but a killer? A villain? He could never be that. There must be a reason for it, perhaps the League was scheming against him, but whatever the case, Bakugo would find out. Damn the evidence. Bakugo proclaimed out loud to Inko Midoriya, who was sleeping in her patient bed, "I'll rescue your son, and I'll bring him back to you, safe and sound." The nursing staff encouraged him to continue talking to her and visiting, even though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. This was especially important since no one showed up. When Katsuki's head suddenly snapped to the television monitor, the news station flashed across the screen to alert him to breaking news. Exciting news. There has been a prison break at Tartarus, the special prison for villain criminals. The League of Villains is allegedly helping criminals escape the scene. Bakugo's eyes widened in surprise. Suddenly, his cell phone rang, and Eijiro Kirishima was listed as the caller ID. But Katsuki was too preoccupied with what he was watching on TV to answer his phone. Sweat trickled from his forehead. The League of Villains was clearly influenced by this incident. Deku, keep your mouth shut, it is 4:30. Location: Tartarus, a special prison for villain criminals. None. For everyone? All Might's face was flushed with surprise as he repeated the words. So, Izuku Midoriya, are you here to murder us? All for One inquired. With his mouth hanging open, All Might turned to look at the symbol of evil and gawked at All for One's question. Death us? The youthful Midoriya wouldn't harm anyone at all? So naive, he thought. It was true that once upon a time the boy felt sick to his stomach at the thought of killing or injuring anyone, but it became easier to bear once he realized that the people who stood in his way were obstacles that had to be removed. Izuku completed All Might's sentence for him, his face plastered with an amused grin. Makoto, she had him figured out. The League of Villains' advancement is hampered by the crawler and Popstep. Queen Bee tried to control him. How sweet that her scheme didn't work out. Queen Bee's passing was regrettable. She was a great asset, as was her quirk. She could have been useful to us, All for One said. Izuku squinted at his erstwhile leader, a gloomy look covering his face. As you attempted to take advantage of me? All Might winced at the venom in Izuku's voice as he spat back at him. Did this boy really want to be a part of the police academy? Please tell me what happened to you, young Midoriya. We might be able to resolve this. There is still time. All Might took a step forward to get closer to number 6, but number 6 immediately moved forward to block All Might's path. We could make things right. Number 6 said regretfully, but his tone was disguised by the smirk on his face. I cannot allow you to get any closer, All Might. All Might clenched his jaw, but before he could say anything else, All for One interrupted. So, Izuku Midoriya, may I ask once more? Are you here to murder us? The inmates are currently escaping, and it will not be long before the pro-heroes invade the facility and arrive to protect Toshinori. Do you really think you'll have time for us? All Might was unnerved by the symbol of evil's even, almost casual tone as he asked. How could he be so composed at this moment? Then it clicked all at once. They were stalling, All for One. Why? Since he was powerless. The only thing he could do was stall for as long as he could until someone came to save them both, since he was shackled behind a glass and couldn't use his quirk without the guns on the wall turning on him. That's correct. All Might and All for One had to cooperate. Young Midoriya, you're right, All for One. The arrival of the pro-heroes is just a matter of time, All Might said, pulling his cell phone out of his pocket and holding it up. It has been determined that I am currently in Tartarus. They'll come and find me. A sly smile appeared on Izuku's face. Don't you two really think you have all the cards? Oh, how the mighty have fallen, the boy started, and he laughed lightly as he said it. It was funny to watch the two of them writhe and wait for time. We'll be long gone by the time any pro-heroes reach this stage. But it's fate, not you or me, that will decide whether we leave you two alive. Izuku extended his hand to Toga, who then proceeded to retrieve a coin from her pocket, placed it in his hand, and got ready to flip it. How about we play a game? It's actually quite easy. Number 6 will kill you both if it's heads. If the result is tails, we will depart. What does that sound like? Sweat trickled from All Might's forehead. He looked into Midoriya's eyes and saw no sign of fear. This child, he had really lost his mind. Interesting, I'll just have to see it by chance. That's a kind decision. Izuku, isn't it true that you had a lower chance of being born quirkless, for example? All for One concluded after reading his protege like a book. Yes, he blamed his actions on fate because he had a greater chance of having a quirk at birth than not, but fate had not been kind to him. All Might commended his arch-enemy, saying the more he stalled, the better. Well done, All for One. You know me so well, Izuku said with a grin that never left his face. Now let's flip the coin. I can't wait to see what it is, Toga added. The anticipation had made her more and more jittery, and she practically bounced up and down with excitement. After giving Toga a nod, Izuku tossed the coin into the air, where it whirled around a few times before Izuku managed to catch it in his hand. His sly smile widened even more as he glanced down at it. It appears to be heads. Would you like to perform the honors, number 6? With pleasure, number 6 said, as his right arm started to flex and flex, its muscles getting bigger and bigger until it was noticeably bigger than the rest of his body. All Might could only back away from the monstrosity while watching in horror. This guy, number 6, wanted to destroy All Might with a single blow, just like All for One had attempted to do to him in their previous battle. This is not necessary for you to do. In an attempt to buy himself more time, All Might begged. At the same time, Toga linked arms with Izuku as they started walking toward the elevators. Farewell, you old relics. Boom. It came as a shock. A man's silhouette appeared between All Might and number 6 after slipping through the ceiling. Despite his remarkable athletic build, he was a rather unremarkable man. He stood tall with his arms crossed in front of his chest, a red cape billowing from his hero costume, and a broad smile that showed off his flawlessly white teeth was etched on his face. On the chest of the enigmatic man's costume was the number 1,000,000. Izuku's and Toga's eyes widened, as did number 6's, but a grin appeared on All Might's face. Stalling had been successful. And now there was a hero. You know, being a hero to another pro-hero doesn't happen very often. However, the man's contagious smile brightened even more as he lifted his fist in the air. The time has come for me to say it. All Might's eyes gleamed with appreciation. Lemillion, let me be your hero, All Might.
So this was the end of the series. I hope you enjoyed it. To watch more series like this, subscribe to my channel. Till then, bye bye.